And I will even say this, such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off, became actualized instead of the prior one, and that in fact, in literal fact, we are once more living this particular segment of linear time. A breaching, a tinkering, a change had been made, but not in our present, had been made in our past. Evidently, such an alteration would have a peculiar effect on those persons involved. They would, so to speak, be moved back one square or several squares on the board game which constitutes our reality. Conceivably, this could happen any number of times, affecting any number of people, as alternative variables were reprogrammed. We would have to live out each reprogramming along the subsequent linear time axis, but to the programmer, whom we call God, to him the results of the programming would be apparent at once. We are within time, and he is not. We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. This, too, might account for the sensation people get of having lived past lives. They may well have, but not in the past. Previous lives, rather, in the present. In perhaps an unending repeated and repeated present, like a great clock dial in which grand clock hands sweep out the same circumference forever, with all of us carried along unknowingly, yet dimly suspecting.
"1928 was a year of promise. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, signed by the US, France, Germany and Japan, had outlawed war forever. Mickey Mouse made his sound debut in Steamboat Willie, and the first successful long-range broadcasts from a new invention were coming to American homes: television. The stock market was roaring, no coming whispers of the Great Depression could be heard, and on the 16th of December 1928, Philip Kindred Dick and his twin sister Jane Charlotte Dick were born into a world caught between two wars and imminent revolution. Philip and Jane arrived 6 weeks early. The labor came on so quickly that there was no chance for their parents, Dorothy and Joseph Edgar, to reach a medical ward. The family was struggling financially, and a hospital was an expense they couldn't afford. Born premature, the twins were tiny and undernourished. Jane weighed just 3.5 pounds, Philip only slightly more. In a freezing Chicago flat, the newborns were kept in a makeshift incubator, nestled together in a shoebox, placed near the open door of the kitchen oven. In a desperate attempt to help keep the newborns warm and well, Dorothy had even placed hot water bottles in the box, later the repercussions of which would become clear. For 44 days, Dorothy struggled to produce enough milk and couldn't find a formula that worked. The infant's constant crying took its toll, and their father, Joseph Edgar, began to spend more time at the local men's club, leaving the twins' struggling first-time mother to try and manage on her own. Dorothy had followed the popular child-rearing manuals of the 1920s, which advocated for a cold, detached approach to parenting, and strict feeding schedules that discouraged coddling. The parents mistook what was the twins' slow starvation for a failure to thrive. No one intervened until late January 1929, when an insurance agent from MetLife visited to process a small $50 life insurance policy the parents had taken out on the infants. The policy had triggered a mandatory visit from a nurse hired by the insurance company to inspect the premises and the children. When the nurse arrived, she found 2 skeletal infants who were dying of starvation. Horrified, she immediately called for a doctor. When he arrived, he found that Philip weighed just 2.5 pounds, while Jane, even more frail, had been badly burned by one of the hot water bottles in her improvised incubator. Recognizing that the twins were about to die, the doctor sent them directly to the hospital. The parents didn't have time to wait for an ambulance, they would have to drive them there themselves. Jane died in the car on the way to the hospital. And it was the most devastating and consequential event in Philip K. Dick's life, heavily impacting everything that came after. Shortly after Jane's death, in 1929, the family left Chicago. Edgar's job as a livestock inspector for the US Department of Agriculture required a transfer, relocating the fractured family to the San Francisco Bay Area. It would be an attempt at a new start in a new city, away from the memory of Jane's death, but it was a tragedy they could not part from, and the parents' marriage had inevitably declined from that moment. Jane's death would forever haunt Philip, with a sense of lost realities. It would cause a gap in space and time, but it also ruptured their family in the most commonplace sense too. By 1932, the drunken elevation of the Jazz Age was coming crashing down and the Great Depression had set in. And it was not just America and Philip K. Dick, but the world at large that was entering a new reality. Imprisoned by the fascists in Italy, the Marxist philosopher Gramsci wrote, "The old world was dying, the new was struggling to be born, and all the while the signs of death were everywhere." In Germany, an up-and-coming politician, Adolf Hitler, had raised his party, the National Socialists, to become the largest force in the country. In China, the bloodiest civil war in human history was raging, and in the newly formed dream of a global utopia of abundance and equality in Russia and Ukraine, millions were dying of starvation. Philip K. Dick might have always been trying to make his way back to the time of his birth, that interim of peace, that time when Jane had lived. He believed in a multiverse. He believed that realities were infinite and varied, and that one of them surely was one in which both he and Jane lived and his parents' marriage had held. In 1977, he said, "We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have is when some variable is changed and an alteration in our reality occurs. I have a persistent feeling that a better timeline exists and that I once inhabited it, but was somehow pulled away." In 1962, more than a decade earlier, in The Man in the High Castle, Philip most famously dreamed up an alternative reality when the Axis powers won World War II. Yet even within the book itself, this timeline is revealed to be a fiction. Through the divination of the I Ching, a vision of another reality breaks through, revealing that the timeline where the Allies won is the true one, and that the characters in the book are living in a fictional universe, just as he later believed that he might be. And in the years after Jane's death, the 3-year-old Philip was struggling to make sense of his father. Edgar was a man of order and routine, tattooed with the trauma of his generation and his service. Trying to play with his young son, or perhaps explain something about his time in the trenches of World War I, Edgar would sometimes wear his rubber gas mask. For his father, it might have seemed like an interesting prop or a way to tell his son about the horror and strangeness of war, but for Philip it was horrifying.
Well, I did, because I was walking along one day and I looked up in the sky and there was this face looking down at me. A giant face with slotted eyes, the face I described in 3 Stigmata. And it was,
when was this?
Well, this was in 63 or so. And I had a little shack that I worked in, that I would go to work at every day, and there was this thing looking down at me. Wasn't really there. I mean, like, I didn't really see it, but it was there. It's like when John Belushi on Saturday Night Live just suddenly turns as if there's something behind him. There it was, looking down at me, and it was evil. Horrible looking thing. Ugh.
How do you think this came about?
Oh, I know how it came about. I finally identified it. I happened to be, years later, I was looking through a copy of Life magazine. I came across a picture of some forts from World War I built on the Marne that were used in one of the battles of the Marne. And it was what I was looking at, incredibly. It looked like the masks that the Germanic knights had on in Alexander Nevsky, if you saw Eisenstein's Nevsky. Well, they had the Teutonic Knights had these goddamn masks, these horrible, slots for eyes, no pupils, nothing. And it was a observation cupola, French observation cupola made out of iron with slots where they could look out and see the Germans. And my father had fought at the Second Battle of the Marne. He had been a Marine in the 5th U.S. Marines. And he'd come back after fighting in all the major battles that the American Marines fought in, which was the Second Battle of the Marne, Belleau Wood, Argonne, and so on. And he came back, and then when I was a little kid, he used to show me his military equipment, including his gas mask. He would put on his gas mask, and his eyes would disappear, and his face would disappear. And he would tell me about the Battle of the Marne. And I know where I got that was my father's description of the horrors that he went through. He told me about things, telling a little 4-year-old child what it was like to fight in World War I. He would tell me about men with their guts blown out, and he would show me his gun and everything. And he would tell me how they fired until their guns were red hot. I looked this up, and it's true. The American 5th Marines stopped the Germans from breaking through at Marne and changed the history of the world. They were green. Americans were green troops. They had never seen battle in Ludendorff, the German, or Hindenburg, whichever it was, put his best men against them, seasoned German troops against green Americans. And the Americans did fire until their guns actually were too hot to hold. And my father was under gas attacks, and they would. He told me of the terrible fear that they would, as the charcoal in the masks would begin to become saturated with the gas, until they would panic and tear the masks off. These made tremendous impressions on me, you know. And my father was a big, handsome man, you know, a football player, a tennis player. And he told me that those experiences, and they were unbelievable. I've read what the U.S. Marines did in that war, and those farm boys, which is what he was, a farm boy, those men underwent just what Remarque describes in All Quiet on the Western Front, unspeakable valor, unspeakable horrors. And he told me, his little son, about that.
Philip believed that his father had transformed into something inhuman. Later, he would fill his fiction with mutants, artificial humans, and grotesque cybernetic entities, often the harrowing manifestations of authority in the state. The family's final break came in 1933, when Philip was just 5 years old. Edgar was ordered to transfer again, this time to Reno, Nevada. Dorothy, who'd grown deeply attached to the progressive, intellectual atmosphere of Berkeley, refused to move, and a custody battle over Philip ensued, with the court ultimately awarding full custody to Dorothy. Edgar moved away, and Philip was effectively severed from his father, rarely seeing him again for the rest of his life. Edgar later settled in Los Angeles, where he hosted a radio show, This Is Your Government, a moderately popular regional program. The media broadcaster, often disembodied, would become one of the most reoccurring features in all of Philip's work. Because his father had permanently relocated to LA following the 1933 divorce, this hazy, crackling, distant voice was the main tie Philip had left to his father, and he found the experience deeply unsettling. His father became the voice of the state, the friendly and open voice of the institutional machine. Into Android's dream of electric sheep, the television and radio personality Buster Friendly keeps the world vacuous and happy with his infinite broadcast, until it's revealed that he is an artificial construction. In Flow My Tears, the policeman said Jason Taverner is promoted to the epitome of fame and success by his media broadcast, until it's torn away by a drug that distorts objective reality. In Dr. Bloodmoney, Walt Dangerfield, an astronaut trapped in space after a nuclear war, is the last public broadcaster. From his capsule, he sends down music to the ruins from his vinyl collection and reads from classical works chapter by chapter to the broken society below. For everyone left alive, he is the omnipotent voice of the old world, the last tie to the time before. As the novel progresses, Dangerfield falls ill, his voice begins to weaken, and as the survivors below lose their omnipotent father figure, the panic sets in. The threat to Dangerfield came not just from his illness, but from a monstrous, power-hungry mutant on Earth who attempts to telekinetically hijack his radio frequency. Dangerfield is saved by Bill Keller, a fully conscious, telepathic twin fetus who's never been born, living entirely inside the body of his sister. A secret, unborn twin prevents the disembodied voice from falling silent. Philip may have dreamed of this 30 years later, but in 1935 the fixed reality of his parents' divorce and the death of his sister was still present in everything. Following the 1933 custody battle, 5-year-old Philip was beginning the estrangement from his father. Over the next 2 years, between the ages of 5 and 7, face-to-face meetings with Edgar were sporadic weekend visits scheduled around his father's travel commitments, and this then ended entirely in 1935 when the 7-year-old Philip was uprooted by his mother to Washington, D.C. Philip spent his middle childhood years in the capital, enrolled at John Eaton Elementary School, where his report card showed that he was a capable student, and a teacher noted on his record that he showed an interest and ability in storytelling. Missing the West Coast, Dorothy moved Philip back to California when he was 10 years old, moving between different rental properties within North Berkeley, living a transient and financially strained existence. By the time the 10-year-old Philip returned to the Bay Area with his mother in 1938, any meaningful bond with his father had been lost. And in the 1940s, when Philip was 12 years old, Edgar was permanently transferred out of California by the Department of Agriculture. This relocation effectively ended all face-to-face contact for the remainder of Philip's adolescence, and the teenage boy was left to be raised entirely by his mother. Following the separation, Dorothy's intense, grief-driven protectiveness made for a rigid and anxious environment. Philip had a difficult relationship with his mother, while his internal world was defined by escalating psychological fragility. By the time he reached the 7th grade, the severe anxiety and internal struggle began to manifest physically. He suffered from intense, paralyzing bouts of vertigo, agoraphobia, and asthma. To treat his lungs, he was prescribed endefendrine, a stimulant, and a small step to what would later help fuel his incredible output in his career, amphetamines. The worst symptom of his anxiety was developing a terrifying inability to swallow food. The condition forced Dorothy to temporarily take him out of public school to be taught at home. For most children, it would have been an isolating and detrimental experience impeding their education, but this was when the 12-year-old Philip K. Dick first found a pulp magazine called Stirring Science Stories. And although Philip was already a voracious reader, familiar with the philosophical depth and science fiction found in the classic literature of H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley, this mass-market magazine offered something entirely different. It was his first introduction into the modern medium of American pulp fiction, a sickly pastel-colored multiverse of equipment-laden spacemen, gross aliens, intricate electronics, and interplanetary paranoia. It was the stuff of pure escapism for a boy who longed to escape. Years before video games or even color TV were commonplace forms of entertainment, the glossy, appealing, fantasy-laden magazines were effortlessly addictive. The term sci-fi would not be coined by fans until 1954, and it was a medium never taken seriously in Philip K. Dick's lifetime. He himself would later detest the idea of working for these magazines, and he first tried to write serious novels which were rejected, until he was forced to if he wanted to make a living as a writer. However, as a young boy, he was fascinated by these magazines, not just the stories, but how technology and our interaction with other beings could change what it meant to be human. This would be apparent as early as his first published work, Beyond Lies the Wurp. Like all writers that last, Philip K. Dick did more than create interesting and enjoyable plots and characters. He was an intellectual that understood the novel could be as much a study of human nature as a drama into which it's set. What began as a desperate distraction to pass the long, lonely hours at home transformed into an obsession, an impetus, a catalyst that his growing anxiety, intellect, and literacy could manifest in. By the time he was well enough to return to school, Philip had changed. He was no longer just an able schoolboy with an ability and interest in storytelling. He was now immersed in the contemporary movement of science fiction and had begun to understand the mass-market medium and why it was so appealing. By the mid-1940s, Philip entered Berkeley High School, where his fractured inner world found two sources of stability: classical music and the bohemian intellectualism of the Bay Area. In 1946, he took a part-time job at University Radio, a local shop owned by Herb Hollis.
I was in a curious position. I had read science fiction since I was 12 years old and was really addicted to reading it. I mean, I just loved it. And I also was reading what the Berkeley intellectual community was reading, which would be like Proust, for example, and Joyce. And so I occupied two worlds right there, which normally did not intersect. I remember I worked at a radio and TV sales store, and after work I'd go home and I'd read Remembrance of Things Past, and really just for enjoyment, and I'd write little artsy stories. And writing a science fiction story was as natural to me as writing a non-science fiction story. In fact, in high school, I was working on a science fiction story, which I still have. Still have a copy of it. And I was never convinced that science fiction was of less value than high literature. My motivation was entirely a pleasure-pain motivation. I read what I read because I liked it. I was extremely rebellious against authority, and if something was considered a classic, I didn't read it because it was a classic. I mean, I wasn't trying to read classics per se. I liked Proust, and I liked Van Vogt. I still like Proust, and I still like Van Vogt. I wrote, I went from high school to a full-time job, a 6-day-a-week job I'll say between a record store and a radio shop. Mm-hmm. And working 6 days a week, I didn't get a chance to do much writing. I got married when I was 19. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until a little later that I really began to write. I got married again when I was 21. I got divorced and married again. And I suddenly began, a point came when I suddenly began to feel that science fiction was very important.
Hollis would quickly become something of a father figure to the isolated teenager. Surrounded by vats of vinyl records, Philip loved listening to Mozart and Wagner, and an interest in German culture and language is something that would reveal itself repeatedly in his work, especially later in his career when he was struggling psychologically. Surrounded by jazz, classical vinyl, and the bohemian culture of Berkeley, he found a community of outcasts who valued his eccentricities rather than treating them as medical symptoms. Graduating from high school in 1947 in the same class as Ursula K. Le Guin, although they never spoke, and with his wages from the store, the 19-year-old Philip left home, found an apartment, and began to make his own way. In early 1948, at 19 years old, he was working as a clerk at the Art Music Company record store on Telegraph Avenue. It was here that he met Jeanette Marlin, a frequent customer who shared his love for classical music. Jeanette was 21 years old, 2 years older than he was, a pragmatic, independent woman born to Finnish parents. At the time, Philip was enduring a profound internal crisis. He was living in a run-down communal apartment, and Dorothy had openly accused him of being a homosexual. Feeling insecure about his identity, Philip thought marriage would set things back in place. He and Jeanette were married on May the 14th, 1948, just a year after he graduated from high school. The young couple had barely known each other, and the marriage collapsed after just 6 months. On November the 30th, 1948, Jeanette filed for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. In the rigid legal system of 1940s California, this didn't imply physical violence. It legally recorded the severe mental distress caused by Philip's rapidly deteriorating psyche, his agoraphobia, anxiety, and an uncompromising refusal to seek a normal career over his absolute and consuming desire to be a writer had torn them apart. The fallout of his failed marriage sent Philip back into isolation. In September of 1949, hoping to better understand the psychological instability that had plagued his boyhood, the 20-year-old Philip enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley. He already had an obsessive interest in history, psychology, and philosophy, and wanted to understand better the strange texture of reality and the seemingly unfixed and fluid shape of his own psychology within it. He didn't declare a traditional major, and instead read and studied broadly, hoping to better understand existence itself from the great thinkers of the past. University introduced him to Plato, the ultimate proponent of a cosmic reality hidden behind a deceptive world, the skepticism of David Hume, and the archetypes of Carl Jung. Already a growing intuition, now further supported by his university lectures, Philip began to more firmly believe that what we call existence is merely a product of internal human perception, always subject to influence and control, rather than a fixed external reality. It was the intellectual mainstay of what would later become postmodern thought, but rather than a Marxist rethinking of power dynamics, it was a far deeper theological and artistic belief that Philip later actualized in his works, creating fictional societies like those in Ubik, in which technology would actually create the conditions to make such subjective distortions possible. He would later incorporate the technology of Pulp Fiction, such as cryo chambers and ray guns he had pored over in his bedroom as a boy. But instead of them being used to help astronauts travel distances while asleep or kill grotesque aliens, technology would be used to change the very foundations of reality and space-time. It was the wedding of his childhood psychological struggle and the garish but appealing pages of pulp science fiction, and by the time he was in his 30s, he would mature into masterpieces. He only continued to study at Berkeley until November the 11th, 1949.
You know, I managed to become universally despised wherever I went. I think that I must have thrived on it because it kept happening so many times in so many ways. This really bore fruit when I went to the University of California and they had mandatory ROTC. You know.
Oh God!
And they gave me an M1 rifle to field strip and. Handing me a rifle to field. I was raised in Quaker schools. I was raised as a Quaker, and they're about the only group in the world that I don't have some grievance against. You know, or some. There's no hassle between me and the Quakers. And I took the damn thing apart, and I honestly tried to put it back together. I really tried. Let the record show that I tried to assemble my M1, but I put the trigger in first instead of last, and it fell down into the damn breech, and it's probably still there, and I had to go and tell the sergeant that I could not put my M1 together. Out of a class of 1,000, I was the only one who couldn't instantly put together an M1 rifle, and I was told to leave the university
The whole university?
Well, what happened was, see, you had to have you not only had to take ROTC, you had to get a passing grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like a character in one of those novels by England's Angry Young Man right after the war.
Mm-hmm.
They'd call me to my feet in ROTC class and they'd say, what is the difference between a rank and a file? And I'd say, a rank, sir, is longer and a file, sir, is shorter. So anyway, I was called in the dean's office, and it was pointed out that in philosophy, for instance, I had an A, and in ROTC, I had less than an F. I actually had more demerits than merits. That if we were asked to appear on the parade ground in uniform, I appeared without my uniform in my civilian clothes, and if it was the other way around, then I appeared the other way around. And if we were required to appear with our jackets, I did not have mine, and vice versa. And they asked me why this was, because if I did not pass ROTC, I had to leave the university. And I said, my reasons are moral. And they said, then get out of this university and don't ever come back. And I did. And I left and I never came back. And it would be really wonderful if I could say that I did it out of some lofty, idealistic motive to protest war. But I just couldn't put that damn rifle back together. And I could not understand things like creeping through the bushes and falling on some unsuspecting prey and other military tactics that were regarded as highly important. But I could go into history class and I could go into philosophy class and I could argue coherently in those subjects. Mm-hmm. But I could not grasp what was being required of me in ROTC. And I think a great deal of my rebellious attitude really stemmed from a simple inability to understand what's being asked of me. I had the same problem in geometry class in high school. Now, there's no political matters, no ideology involved in geometry. And I would be asked to get up to the blackboard and perform, one of those things that they do in geometry, a name I can't understand, a theorem or something like that. And I wouldn't be able to do it. And then they would yell at me. And I have this image of this figure yelling at me. No one has ever trisected the angle in 4,000 years, and you're not going to be able to trisect the angle now. Get away from that blackboard for God's sake. And I would continue on trying to trisect the angle. And would wind up. I wound up in my grade in geometry on my final exam was F-, because all I was able to do was write my name on the paper. I wasn't even able to draw the figure that we had to do the theorem about. I couldn't even draw it.
For a young man deeply committed to pacifism, the requirement to put on a uniform and march in lockstep with a state-sponsored military machine was a psychological impossibility. The vast, crowded university lecture halls triggered sudden, violent bouts of claustrophobia and severe vertigo. Simply attending classes had become an overwhelming physical ordeal, and in interviews and later in his semi-autobiographical novel Radio Free Album Earth, Philip insisted that he didn't simply walk away. Philip would refuse to allow his mind or body to be institutionalized by the state, and he preferred to leave the institution rather than conform to it. By June 1950, he was finding himself better grounded when he married his second wife, Cleo Apostolides. She was a sharp, fiercely independent student of Greek heritage, embedded in the local socialist circles of Berkeley. She had a grounded, practical intelligence that acted as a better anchor for Philip's chaotic mind. Unlike Dorothy, or his first wife, Cleo didn't try to cure Philip of his psychological troubles, but understood and embraced them as part of the engine of his creativity, and together they moved into a chaotic communal house on Franklin Street. The rundown residence was a crucible for the literary underground. Philip was surrounded by avant-garde poets and political activists. For the first time in his life, he began to feel that his unique psychological difficulties were maybe a part of his creative personality rather than a medical defect. Running on cheap coffee and an escalating reliance on stimulants, he committed himself to a relentless and exhausting writing schedule. It finally paid off in late 1951. The 22-year-old made his first professional sale with the short story Rogue to fantasy and science fiction magazine. Inspired by a local dog, the story was told from the dog's perspective as it tried to warn its owners about rogues, monstrous, threatening entities that turned out to just be garbage collectors. While Rogue was his first sale, his publication was delayed until 1953, meaning his second sale, Beyond Lies the Wub, which was bought by Planet Stories magazine, would be his first published work. The strange and dark vignette featured a telepathic pig-like alien who discusses ancient myths with the space crew intending to eat it. And what would become common in the haunting psychology of Philip K. Dick's later work, the creature's consciousness takes over the captain's brain after being killed. The story served as the definitive launchpad for his career when it was released in July of 1952 and intrigued pulp editors and local science fiction circles. Philip K. Dick was no longer the broken teenage outcast, the failed husband, or the university dropout. He had permanently established the brutal writing ethic, the incorporation of technology and consciousness, and the blending of the historical classics with the aesthetics of Pulp Fiction into what would make for the greatest science fiction writer of the 20th century. He was now in print. Philip K. Dick had become a writer.
I think I once experienced a track in which the Savior returned, but I experienced it just briefly. I am not there now. I am not sure I ever was. Certainly I may never be again. I grieve for that loss, but loss it is. Somehow I moved laterally, but then fell back, and then it was gone. A vanished mountain and a stream, the sound of bells, and all gone now for me, entirely gone. I, in my stories and novels, often write about counterfeit worlds, semi-real worlds, as well as deranged private worlds, inhabited often by just one person, while meantime the other characters either remain in their own worlds throughout, or are somehow drawn into one of the peculiar ones. This theme occurs in the corpus of my 27 years of writing. At no time did I have a theoretical or conscious explanation for my preoccupation with these pluriform pseudo-worlds, but now I think I understand. What I was sensing was the manifold of partially actualized realities lying tangent to what evidently is the most actualized one, the one which the majority of us, by consensus gentium, agree on.
In 1952, the Democratic Party adopted the defining political slogan of the age, "Don't let them take it away, you never had it so good." They were right. In the early 1950s, the United States of America was, by every measure, the greatest country in the world. It was entering an era of unprecedented economic expansion in human history, and propped up by mass employment and a wave of new, magical-seeming consumer goods. Products like the washing machine, the fridge freezer, the instant camera, and the plastic credit card were completely changing everyday life. It was the age of comforting television and effortless conformity. Glass screens curating a clear picture of consumer contentment, corporate benevolence, and social unity. Programs like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver would soon become the definitive cultural templates of this era. More than entertainment, they were electric pamphlets for the new society of middle-class, all-American success. It was a time of what would become known as the beginnings of consumerism, and following the tragedy of World War II was a surreal period of peace, abundance, and security. Yet there existed another side to the sheen, one ripe with a propensity for unrest and disillusion. This was the nuclear age, and despite all the happy dreamers, the most nightmarish weapon, the H-bomb, was being openly tested and readied, and what would become the inanimate protagonist of the Cold War. It was then, in 1952, at age 23, that Philip K. Dick became a published writer. He was still living with Cleo in a cheap communal apartment in Berkeley, surrounded by the activists of the rebel underground. When he saw himself in print for the first time, it brought on a rush and elation. The Planet Stories editor, Jack O'Sullivan, had written Philip an encouraging letter praising Beyond Lies the Wub as a very fine little story, a much longed-for affirmation of his writing ability, and a dream that Philip had given up on a mainstream and stable life to follow. But the true reality of working as a writer soon became apparent. The payment for Beyond Lies the Wub was $15, and there was no stable publishing contract to follow. The average rent in Philip's neighborhood was about $50 a month, and working full-time at minimum wage would have brought in twice what he'd made with the story. And if he was going to continue to write for a living, even in relative poverty with no savings, he would have to write and sell a complete work of fiction every week with 0 rejections. Despite all this, he persevered, and over the course of 1952 up until the end of 1953, Philip wrote and sold 62 short stories, an accomplishment and an output that many writers would never achieve over their entire careers. His relentless production was managed by the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, which he'd signed with in the spring of 1952. With his agency aggressively flooding the market, Philip wrote entirely original works, edited them, and successfully sold them every 9 or 10 days. He sold to virtually every pulp science fiction magazine of the era: If, Galaxy, Imagination, Orbit, and Astounding Science Fiction. In these early short stories, Philip, just as he would subvert society, reality, and eventually his own psyche, began to subvert science fiction. While other contemporary authors like Robert A. Heinlein or Isaac Asimov celebrated technological progress, space colonization, and the triumph of humanity in pristine, orderly expansion, Philip's stories were those of anxious protagonists, faulty machines, and environments prone to sudden decomposition. In stories like The Variable Man and Second Variety, technology is not a tool of human liberation, but an autonomous, horrifying force that eludes human control, mirroring the growing anxiety of a society trapped in the grip of what Eisenhower would dub the military-industrial complex. Philip was beginning to realize that the corporate state's obsession with efficiency and conditioning was stripping humanity of its flaws, of its absoluteness, of its theological quality, and of its empathy. These early ideas would later manifest fully in his novels, particularly with the manufactured, empathy-driven religion of mercerism, or the instant fix of pleasure commodified in the dial-up Penfield mood organ into Android's dream of electric sheep.
As I said in the introduction in Unearth, in Berkeley at that time, it was the goal of everyone to be a writer, but we didn't conceive of it by and large in terms of being a published writer. That is, writing as a economic consideration. I mean, people wrote the way, for instance, a person writes a poem, he doesn't expect to make a living off it.
That's right. You said you were looked at actually as almost having sort of sold out in some peculiar.
Yes, well, this really, I think I exaggerated that somewhat. That wasn't the general view, but it wasn't customary. It was not customary to submit one's writing after one wrote a story to submit it to a magazine. And the people who read science fiction were a very distinct, small, separate group of people cut off from the general Berkeley intellectual community. There was no concourse between the science fiction people and the greater intellectual community, cultural community surrounding the university.
By late 1953, the sheer exhaustion of the short story market, paired with his agent Scott's advice that the paperback novel was coming back, persuaded Philip to return to writing novels. This was not a new form for him. Despite working for pulp magazines to get by, Philip had already written his first long-form manuscript, Gather Yourselves Together, in 1952. Set against the backdrop of the 1949 Chinese Communist Revolution, the novel follows 3 American employees stranded at a decommissioned company site. It was a dense, dialogue-heavy rumination on lost innocence and political isolation, featuring an anxious young protagonist who was clearly Philip behind a thin literary veil. This was followed by Voices from the Street, a cold, naturalistic reflection on the American dream. The narrative centered on Stuart Hadley, a deeply alienated young man working in a television repair shop. Consumed by a nameless, suffocating existential dread, surrounded by the consumer abundance of the early 50s, Hadley spirals into a slow, alcohol-fueled breakdown, another clear reflection of Philip's own growing struggles. Neither of these dense, realistic novels sold, but the motifs and characters that would form part of the late greatness were set down. Philip, who as an anxious young man had repaired electronics at University Radio in Berkeley, would later become Jack Bolan in Martian Time-slip, a deeply alienated mechanic on Mars who uses the predictable, logical laws of circuitry as a psychological shield against a reoccurring schizophrenia. He would become John Isidore in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or J.F. Sebastian in Blade Runner, a lonely outcast seen as a simpleton and a fool. But John seems to be the only character plagued with a profound sense of loss and isolation in a dying world, working for a robotic repair shop that masquerades as a veterinary hospital so his clients can hide their social shame of owning artificial animals instead of real ones. The themes and the voice were coming, but the realistic novels were not yet sellable. Scott Meredith advised Philip to instead use the science fiction settings that he'd already been working on to write, and this would lead to his debut novel. Written in 1954, Philip K. Dick's first novel, Solar Lottery, was published by Ace Books in 1955 as part of the Ace Double series. Engineered by New York publisher A. A. Wynn and editor Donald A. Wollhelm, the Ace Double was the ultimate commodity of the pulp era, a cheap head-to-tail paperback that sold at newsstands for 35 cents. The books had 2 front covers and no back cover. A reader would finish one novel, flip the book completely upside down, and begin reading the second novel from the reverse side. Using an original, creative marketing strategy, Ace Books bound the novel by the bankable, established author on one side to carry the risk of the unproven writer on the other. Philip's debut novel was issued as Ace Double D103, bound back-to-back with The Big Jump by the popular and established lay bracket. For Philip, who was already hyper-attuned to the state's obsession with efficiency and the art-destroying nature of mass production, the reality of the Ace Double format held a dark irony. Because 2 books had to conform to a standardized spine thickness for shipping, Ace editors casually chopped and abridged manuscripts without an author's consent to ensure the physical layout. Also, the 35-cent price meant that the already very small royalties had to be split between 2 writers. Over 10,000 words were cut from the novel, and Philip was paid a flat advance of $750, about 2 months of average wages at the time. Most quick, professional writers could hope at best to write a novel a year. This would mean for Philip, even as a published writer, he would still be well below the poverty line, unless he wrote several novels in a year. Philip's coming visions of degraded output in the age of mass consumerism were realized in his own work at its very inception. Solar Lottery, however, was pivotal. Not just because it was Philip's first published novel, but because it was, for the first time, his attempt to truly give the depth and reach of his literary and personal feelings, the science fiction format which would make him as a writer, and create the legacy which would change how science fiction itself was viewed. Solar Lottery is set in the year 2203, in a world controlled by corporate giants. Social and political power no longer arise from institutions, but are distributed and governed by a lottery, the Quizmastership. Even the ruler of the world, called the Quizmaster, is selected at random by a machine called the Twitch, keeping power random and chaotic. Previous nightmarish visions of the future, like 1984, published in 1949, just a few years earlier, always viewed the government as all-powerful, and imagined monopolistic, monochrome societies as a result. Solar Lottery mirrored the modernizing revolution that corporate America was undergoing, and what would a generation later become the cliché-ridden fear of the dystopian genre. By the 1970s and 80s, it would lead to a generation of writers and filmmakers with cynical visions like Soylent Green, Alien, and The Terminator. Ultimately, it would be the adoption of the cyberpunk genre, which Philip K. Dick essentially mainstreamed, and what would become the classic Philip K. Dick protagonist. Ted Bentley is a skilled technician who finds himself forced to swear a feudal oath of allegiance to a corporation to survive. It was the underlying dilemma that had haunted Philip since his first marriage and leaving home, the prospect of normality and stability at the expense of giving up his art. Philip also introduced a concept that we fully realized in his later novels, like The Penultimate Truth in 1964 and The Unteleported Man in 66, the monetization of thought and information control. The corporations in Solar Lottery manipulate the populace through massive media broadcasts and engineered spectacles, creating a population so distracted by the lottery that they're incapable of recognizing their own subjugated existence. Solar Lottery had sold over 100,000 copies as an ace double, and for that, Philip was paid a few $100s, enough to continue to live in poverty for a few months. If he wanted to carry on as a writer, he'd have to continue to grind out Pulp Fiction. He may have rallied against the domination of the corporate state and the dreams of his fiction, but in waking life, he was as much a part of it as ever. Despite his newly found commercial success within the science fiction genre, Philip was still torn creatively. Throughout the mid-1950s, he was consumed by a desperate desire for validation from the mainstream intellectual and literary establishment in which he was immersed. He still considered science fiction a financial compromise, knowing it was not taken seriously in literary culture. Although he continued to write science fiction that sold, his passion for the realist American novel remained clear. And while he composed narratives about starships, time travel, and telepathic mutants by day to pay the rent, he spent his nights attempting high-prose, ultra-realist modernist novels. These works targeted the quiet, psychological decay of a generation chilled by the damp of the creeping Cold War. Between 1955 and 1956, Philip produced a series of powerful, non-science fiction manuscripts, including Mary and the Giant and The Broken Bubble. These novels were completely devoid of speculative features. Instead, they were deeply psychological, naturalistic examinations of characters trapped within the economic and social confines of the Bay Area. Philip sent these manuscripts to the major literary publishing houses in New York, still convinced that they represented his true artistic calling. Editors at houses like Knopf, Harcourt Brace, and Simon & Schuster have rejected every single manuscript. The literary establishment found his realism too abrasive, his prose too casual, and his vision of American life too bleak. And they couldn't understand a writer who refused to celebrate the triumphs of the modern middle class or dared to suggest fracture lines in the nuclear family. These rejections were a catastrophic blow to Philip and cemented a profound sense of exclusion and being fundamentally misunderstood.
I had read a lot of psychology, I read a lot of Jung, and I was interested in Jung's idea of projection, and that is that a lot of what we experience as external to us is really projected from our unconscious. And that meant, of course, that each person's world had to be somewhat different than everybody else's, because the contents of his unconscious would be, to a certain extent, unique. And I began a series of stories in which people experienced worlds which were projections of their own psyches. And I was doing this when I first began to sell, like Rube, my first story, is a perfect example of what I was trying to do, where the dog sees the world completely different from the way human beings see the world. And although it's a fantasy, it was related to a very large number of stories that I wrote which were not precisely fantasies and were simply not marketable because they were neither fantasies, they had no fantasy premise, nor were they realistic. And what I called them was interior projection stories. And I tried to explain, I already had, by that time I had Scott Meredith as my agent, and he couldn't sell them and didn't want to handle them. And I tried to explain what I was trying to do, and that was I was showing each person with a different world, and the contents of that world consisting to a large degree of material from his own mind, which came back at him from outside, and which he did not recognize as his own mind coming back at him from outside. Now this is an idea that has never left me, that a good deal of what each of us experiences is a projection of his unconscious, and it's not, as I say, it was Jung's idea, not mine. And it's an idea that grew stronger in me rather than weaker, but I had to abandon eventually writing everything except science fiction and fantasy, because although I wrote 11 novels and many short stories which were not science fiction or fantasy, they all contained the element of the projected personal unconscious or projected collective unconscious, and were simply incomprehensible to anyone who read them, because it would require you to accept my premise, which essentially was that each of us lives in a unique world.
Philip returned to the science fiction novel with The World Jones Made, another 35-cent ace double. It was set in a post-apocalyptic 2002, in a world tightly managed by a world government called FedGov, which enforces an ideology known as Hoff's relativism. Under this regime, absolute truths, political fanaticism, and dogmatic opinions are illegal. The central figure, Floyd Jones, a morose and impoverished carnival fortune teller, possesses the mutant ability to see exactly 1 year into the future. When his absolute predictions break the law of relativism, he clashes with the FedGov agent Doug Cusick. Jones eventually uses this gift to whip up a fanatical xenophobic movement around himself to overthrow the government. The idea that humanity's ability to see into the future would end up as telepaths for hire while solipsistic ventures was being conceived by Philip in the mid-50s, a time when most contemporary television and radio was heavily censored and happily prosaic. These strange subversions of the usual tropes will become fully realized later in Ubik, the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and we can remember it for you wholesale, when it was adapted as Total Recall. Berkeley in the 1950s was becoming increasingly radicalized, turning into a haven for open Marxists. Civil rights groups and the growing free speech movement caused the government deep anxiety, prompting the implementation of surveillance and intervention. Philip's second wife, Cleo Apostolides, was part of this left-wing movement, attending rallies and distributing literature, and she'd been noticed. In the mid-1950s, 2 agents from the FBI arrived at her and Philip's home. The agents didn't come to implicitly threaten Philip or Cleo with immediate arrest. Instead, they attempted to exploit the couple's precarious financial situation to convince them to assist them. The agents proposed that Philip and Cleo act as spies. In return, they would be given free, fully funded places at the University of Mexico, provided they agreed to spy on their fellow students and act as informants there. Philip and Cleo refused to cooperate, but the encounter had a brutal and lasting effect. The grim, authoritarian state Philip had dreamed of what becomes so omnipotent later in his work, had arrived on his doorstep with two android-like men of the system. It was a horrible encounter with the government for a young man whose estranged father was the friendly voice of the radio show "This Is Your Government," distributing benevolent advice to the people. There was a clear undermining of the American dream of free thought and free conscience, and would stay with Philip forever, becoming the police and surveillance state in Minority Report, and A Scanner Darkly, where mutinous layers of personages start a circle of spying that has no clear beginning or end. Philip had struggled with anxiety, agoraphobia, and psychosomatic symptoms since he was a boy, but now, because of the underhanded and unconstitutional tactics undertaken by the FBI, he became paranoid. The surveillance and intrusion into his home was legal chicanery. The FBI had claimed that because the agents framed the interaction as a voluntary proposition, offering paid tuition in exchange for information, it was not an interrogation. It was a cynical legal strategy and psychological manipulation intended to intimidate young intellectuals. For Philip, it shattered any lingering idealism he might have had for the state. This newfound cynicism and psychological awakening was immediately channeled into a novel in 1957, Eye in the Sky. It was an artistic leap that brought a new level of structural soundness and thematic maturity to his work. His previous fiction had happily held the chaotic tropes of the pulp sci-fi that he loved: mutants, starships, and telepaths. But in Eye in the Sky, Philip formed a distinct symmetrical narrative. 8 people are caught in a particle-accelerated accident, and while their bodies lie broken on the floor, their minds are forced to cycle through the subjective subconscious of each individual member. It was an attempt at making pure universal empathy plausible, the collective unconscious of Carl Jung, and to express the shared cultural anxiety of the age. Written in the direct aftermath of the FBI visit, the novel was a balm for his own growing ills. Through the protagonist Jack Hamilton, a defense contractor facing ruin because his wife is accused of left-wing subversion, Philip places himself clearly in the fictional universe of his novel to play out and work out the trappings of his own surreal situation. The 1950s were ending, and Philip's life as he'd known it was ending too. He and Cleo left Berkeley and the intellectual underground, and in 1958 they moved to Point Reyes together. It was an attempt to escape the urban stress and the environment that had triggered Philip's agoraphobia. They tried to find some respite in the countryside, but the rural isolation began to cause more ruptures in their relationship. While Philip stayed home to write, Cleo was forced to make a tedious commute back to her job in Berkeley, leaving him alone with his vacillating anxieties and increasing the distance between them. His marriage to Cleo, which had provided a decade of bohemian excitement and intellectual companionship in Berkeley, failed under the weight of his escalating anxieties, his growing agoraphobia, and his increasing reliance on stimulants. The isolation of Point Reyes did not heal their relationship. Instead, it was a catalyst for its collapse. They'd been there only a few weeks when a local neighbor, an eccentric, creative, and tempestuous widow named Anne Rubenstein, walked down the road to welcome them. She and Philip soon began an affair, and Philip filed for divorce from Cleo. It was finalized in early 1959, and Philip married Anne on the 1st of April. Anne had 3 young daughters, and Philip became a father to them. On the surface, Philip had finally constructed the traditional domestic architecture he'd chased since his brief failed marriage to Jeanette Marlin in 1948. He was now a husband, a father, a property owner, and a respectable member of a small-town suburban community, participating in school board meetings and local social events. But the vast, fog-shrouded landscape functioned as an isolation chamber rather than a refuge. The silence of the countryside amplified his internal chaos, and it was during this period of domestic claustrophobia that he wrote Time Out of Joint in 1959, a novel that bridged his early political critiques and his defining sci-fi masterpieces. It was, if any novel can be, ahead of its time in every conceivable way. It features the trippy surrealism of the 1960s before the counterculture had even heard of LSD. It held the paranoia and artificially constructed world that would be closely simulated in The Truman Show, and the personal, candid, and tragic truth of mental illness that would not be shown in popular culture until the 90s. The protagonist, Ragel Gum, lives a peaceful, idyllic life in a small American town in 1959. His entire career consists of winning a daily newspaper contest called Where Will the Little Green Man Be Next? Gum is a celebrated local eccentric, but then strange things begin to happen. A soft drink stand literally disintegrates before his eyes, leaving behind a small piece of paper with the words "soft drink stand" printed on it, and eventually he discovers the truth. The year is actually 1998, and the Earth is engaged in a civil war with lunar colonists. His idyllic 1959 town is a massive, simulated environment constructed by the government to exploit his unique pattern recognition abilities. The newspaper contest is actually a disguised military tracking system used to predict the trajectory of lunar missiles. And it was a revolution, and yet at the time of publication, the novel was either dismissed or ignored. At the same time, between 1959 and 1960, Philip made one final, desperate attempt to break into the literary mainstream, writing Puttering About in a Small Land, Humpty Dumpty in Oakland, and what would become his most famous realist work, Confessions of a Crap Artist. These novels were brutal, ultra-realistic autopsies of the American dream, and when his literary agent at the Meredith Agency flatly informed him that these manuscripts were completely unmarketable and no mainstream publisher would ever accept them, this meant that Confessions of a Crap Artist would remain unpublished until a small release in 1975, the only one of his realist novels to be published in his lifetime. Because of these rejections, Philip suffered a total psychological collapse. It was a crushing realization. The industry had permanently branded him as a pulp writer, someone who could only churn out cheap paperbacks with wacky plots. He abandoned his mainstream ambitions entirely, returning to his isolated writing shack with a growing, gnawing sense of desperation and hopelessness. But if the world insisted that he be a pulp sci-fi writer, then he would be, and he would smuggle in every philosophical and artistic trick he had alongside it. And at the time, in his domestic life, Philip tried to become the stable, grounded father to Anne's 3 young daughters, but to cope with the chaos of the household and the financial demands of his new life, Philip's reliance on amphetamines escalated from an occasional medical necessity into a full-scale, daily dependency. He began consuming massive quantities of prescription stimulants and locking himself away to work for days at a time. He later said this was largely to help support the lifestyle that Anne had become accustomed to and expected to continue.
The only drugs that I took regularly were amphetamines, and that was in order to be able to write as much as I had to write to make a living. I was being paid so little per book that I had to turn out a very large number of books. I turned out, I think I published 16 novels in 5 years at one point, and I had an extremely expensive wife, extremely expensive children. I mean, she bought a Jaguar, we had a 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house on 10 acres of land, and she would see a new car that she liked the looks of and just pull off and buy it. And under California law, I was legally bound by her debts. And I just wrote like mad, and the only way I could write that much, I did 60 finished pages a day, was to take amphetamines, and these were prescribed for me. And you just cannot turn out that much copy, unless you, at least I couldn't. And I finally stopped taking them, and I don't write as much as I used to.
On the 25th of February, 1960, Philip and Anne had their first and only biological child, Laura Archer Dick. According to Anne, the first words Philip whispered were, "And this is for Jane." This newborn baby girl was his to care for now, and to try and heal as he could those first scars that had been cut into him before he was even old enough to recall them. Philip was about to enter the most critically acclaimed, yet most psychologically challenging period of his whole life so far. In 1961, the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill had predicted was finally draped across Europe. The Berlin Wall solidified the seemingly unalterable escalation of the Cold War into a nuclear one. And in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought humanity closer than it ever has been before or since to the doomsday. It was in this undertow of the nuclear tide that Philip K. Dick began writing his first work that would force the world, literary or otherwise, to stop and pay attention. He wrote and published his first definitive masterpiece, a novel that could not be dismissed as simple pulp science fiction, The Man in the High Castle. The novel was set in a parallel 1962, and in Philip K. Dick's timeline, the real-world 1933 assassination attempt on President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt succeeds, leaving the United States incapable of recovering from the Great Depression or mobilizing its industrial power to oppose the fascists. As a result, the Axis powers win World War II. After the United States is defeated, it's carved up into occupied territories. Nazi Germany controls the East, and Imperial Japan rules the Pacific coast. The novel was not the typical trope-filled underdog rebels rising story, but instead a work of sincere and deep philosophy on the duality of truth, fiction, history, and oneself in alien circumstances. The Man in the High Castle is itself a four-dimensional, self-consuming work in the shape of Ouroboros. Philip used the Egil, an ancient Chinese method of future prediction, by casting stalks of bamboo to plot out the novel, and this is exactly the method by which the author inside the novel writes his own work of fiction where the Allies win. There are multiple protagonists rather than just one simple hero and villain, and again, Philip had written another version of himself as one of the primary characters, Frank Fink. Frank is a secret Jew, hiding his lineage in Japanese-occupied California, trapped in a job he hates forging counterfeit antiques. At the time, in real life, Philip was seriously considering quitting writing to work full-time to support Anne's jewelry business. And there was also Nobusuke Tagomi, a Japanese official in San Francisco with a secret empathy for America, and Juliana Frink, Frank's estranged wife who lives in the Rocky Mountain states and becomes obsessed with an underground banned book called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. The book within a book written by the isolated author Hawthorne Abenson, who's known as the Man in the High Castle, is an alternative history that describes a timeline where the Allies won. At the end of the novel, Juliana Frink tracks down Hawthorne Abenson at his home, only to discover that he does not live in a castle but just an ordinary suburban house. She confronts him about how he wrote The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, and Abenson admits that he did not plan the book. Instead, he used the I Ching to write it. The I Ching even recited it would be a great success, the first of his career. The Man in the High Castle was the seamless blending of the creative world of fiction with the objective reality in which it was written. It was the line between the beginning and end that all considered and mature narratives must draw. It was an original play on the fourth wall that was a decade ahead of what would come later in Vonnegut's works, Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions. The Man in the High Castle was an international literary sensation, winning the prestigious Hugo Award for Best Novel in 1963. At 22, Philip K. Dick had become a writer, and at age 34, he finally made it as an artist. The Man in the High Castle proved science fiction could be just as meaningful, potent, and sincere as any other genre. It should have been a time of peace and celebration in Philip's life. The exertions he placed on himself had paid off. 1963 was the year when he made it, but it was also when everything began to fall apart. Despite winning the Hugo Award, Philip was still financially very unsound. The award brought no prize money, and initially The Man in the High Castle only brought in a few $1,000s, barely enough to cover his past debt, and certainly not enough to sustain a mortgage and 4 children. Philip would remain financially dependent on Anne's successful jewelry business, a reality that deeply wounded his artistic pride and had been building into an explosive resentment. The stress and inhuman demands of his writing pace had increased his amphetamine use. At this point, the amount he was consuming was dangerous, and Philip began to suffer from intense, drug-induced delusions, telling neighbors and friends that Anne was trying to poison and kill him. There has been no evidence of this procured since, but Philip at the time was convinced. Exploiting the legal loopholes of the time, Philip convinced a local psychiatrist of his delusions about Anne and had her committed to a psychiatric facility for 2 weeks. When Anne was finally released, she discovered the massive pharmacy bills detailing the extent of the drug use that Philip had been hiding. After this incident, the marriage could not be saved. Unable to reconcile with this, Philip fled the Point Reyes home in a moment of anxiety. It was a desperate act in the midst of a severe psychological crisis. He fled to a small, dark and dingy apartment in San Rafael, completely severed from his past, absolutely exhausted, and on the verge of a complete breakdown. He had achieved everything he dreamed of creatively, but just like in all the old fables, it had cost him everything. Yet truly, the writing had only just begun. The romance of the underappreciated writer ahead of his time is reserved solely for readers. There had been harbingers. So wrote Philip K. Dick in the first line of his first published novel. There always had been. And in 1963, the same year that he was recognized and celebrated for his talent, those ill omens from the past came back into reality. Philip had suffered severe psychological illnesses since he was a boy. He had been circling the darkness with greater speed and turmoil all throughout his building career. The combination of his amphetamine use, his inhuman work ethic, and the pressure of being finally celebrated as a great writer, while having all of his serious, heartfelt works ignored, pushed him over the edge. He had been a kind and loving stepfather to Anne's 3 daughters and a devoted father to Laura, but their intense relationship and clashing personalities, combined with Philip's escalating drug use and growing paranoia, meant that he finally slipped from the confines of a stable family life and let the underground swallow him whole. Left entirely alone, with unrestricted access to alcohol and drugs, surrounded by classic vinyl, a growing paranoia, and a true sense of fractured reality to indulge it, Philip began the most frantic, chemically aided, and productive writing period of his career. He had learned to work at a pace that defied sense since his early 20s, and now he was free to use it. In this period of creative madness, Philip began with The Game Players of Titan, published in late 1963. Earth had been conquered by telepathic aliens from Titan, and the broken, mostly sterile people left alive play a board game called Bluff to decide their fate. The protagonist, Pete Garden, is psychologically troubled and loses his property and his wife. It was everything that was happening to Philip, and so it was in the novel. Without even pausing between novels, his writing days a haze of frenzy, and Philip returned to a manuscript he'd started while still living with Anne at Point Reyes. It would first be serialized as All We Marsmen in the 1963 issue of Worlds of Tomorrow magazine, before Ballantine Books published it as a complete paperback novel, Martian Time-slip, in April of 1964. Martian Time-slip was the first time that Philip so explicitly addressed the issue of schizophrenia and the ability of one to experience reality entirely different under the influence of drugs. It was a confessional piece, beautiful, sad, and rather than self-indulgent or some crude celebration of madness, it was a profound reflection on the cost. The principal character in the story is an autistic boy, Manfred Steiner, who, because of his condition, perceives time differently. In a genius twist of narrative, the protagonist, Jack Bolan, realizes this gift when Manfred draws a picture of a luxury apartment complex yet to be built. When the petty, corrupt union leader of the colony, Arnie Knott, and Jack's own opportunistic father, Leo Bolan, discover this, they want to exploit Manfred's gift to look into the future and buy up cheap land where these complexes will then be built. So that Arnie Knott can communicate with Manfred directly, who usually only manages to say variations of the word gubble, he hires Jack to build a specialized machine. Before they can try the machine though, Arnie discovers that Jack's father, Leo, has bought up the land before him. In a leap of desperation, Arnie decides to try and use Manfred's time-perceiving abilities for himself. He knows from his servant Helio, one of the native Bleakmen who live on Mars, about a sacred site called Dirty Nobby, which can be used as a portal. Arnie believes that he might be able to use Manfred's ability to go through the portal and turn back time and then buy the land himself. However, during the ceremony, Manfred's mind is so powerful that although it does turn back time, it also subjectively warps everything into his own state of perception. A nightmarish time loop is created, and the world begins to fold into the entropic filth of gubble. Martian Time-slip was the full descent into what would become the primeval power of Philip K. Dick's writing, a prose and imagination so raw and powerful that it would begin, like Manfred's own mind, to draw the reader inside it. The narrative even slips into Manfred's perspective, where alternating words and notions are a form of gubbish, such as gubblers gubbling each other with their gubbish to gubble. The structure of Martian Time-slip moves in time with the events, replaying and revisiting the same scene from different perspectives. Not only does this in a slightly different narrative voice, but in an entirely altered state of mind, written as truthfully as only one inside the wells of creative madness can draw.
I mean, it's been a long road, but science fiction offered me a road in which I could, a route by which I could publish the kind of thing that I wanted to write. I was reading Martian Time-slip the other night. Now that is exactly what I wanted to write. The invasion of one person's world by another person's world. As I was reading it, I was thinking, you know, this is really strange stuff indeed. But this is definitely what I had wanted to do from the very beginning. The way the autistic boy's world takes over, say, Arnie Cott, takes over Jack Bolan, and so on. That I did get into print in, say, Martian Time-slip and a number of books. The premise which was to me so important, and that is not just that we live, each of us, in a somewhat unique world of our own psychological contents, but that the subjective world of one rather powerful person can infringe on the world of another person. I mean, this is something that I began to see ramifications of politically and psychologically, where people can exert a domineering power over others. I mean, if I can make you see the world the way I see it, then you will automatically think the way I think. You will come to the conclusions I come to. If I can control your perception, and that the greatest power that a human being can exert over others is to get control of their perceptions of reality and essentially infringe on the integrity and individuality of their world. And this is done in politics, and this is done, for instance, in psychotherapy.
Martian Time-slip was followed by The Penultimate Truth, published in 1964, a work of fiction that turned the cultural underground into a literal one. In the novel, as a Third World War between the East and West seems inevitable, and the majority of the human population shelters underground, they're crammed into working bunkers to escape what they believe is the lethal atmosphere above. To continue the war, leadies, that is, robotic fighters, are created, while the workforce stays below. Unbeknownst to the people living in the tanks, however, the global war only lasted 2 years, and the leaders of both sides have already signed a peace treaty. They also agreed to keep the rest of the population deceived and controlled, meaning that they could share out the Earth's resources among the small elite left on the surface. While millions of people have been living in grimy, subservient filth making leadies for the leaders above, the Earth has completely returned to normality and the atmosphere is safe. However, to keep the people deceived, the Yantsmen, the leaders of the West, create fake broadcasts by a synthetic simulacrum, informing the subterranean tank dwellers of the continuing horror of the war. This keeps the subterranean slaves in a perpetual grueling cycle of production, making leadies not, as they believe, for the war, but to serve as private workforces for the massive personal demences, entire districts that the elite now own. And if the tanks do not produce enough leadies, their food supply is cut off. The protagonist, Nicholas St. James, the president of one of these tanks, realizes their engineer is dying, and when they can't get a replacement, he tries to illegally climb to the surface to find an artificial organ to save him. But when Nicholas gets to the surface, he discovers the truth. It was an original reimagining of Plato's allegory of the cave, and a timeless play on the deceptive minority. It was infused with a growing fear of the reach of technology, made only stranger and more personal by Philip's own father, that disembodied broadcaster, the voice of "This is your government." Just a year before, Philip had lived in a sprawling, beautiful estate in the countryside with his daughter and stepdaughter in his home. Now, he was living in filthy, dark, airless apartments in Berkeley, surrounded by the manifestations of his nightmarish fiction. He had abandoned all attempts at normality. He did not rise with the sun nor sleep when it set. He wrote for days, literally at a time. He listened to Beethoven, Wagner, and Mahler symphonies loudly, continuously. He was in terrible health, his agoraphobia was rampant, and he was now convinced that the FBI, his publishers, and even Anne were actively spying on him. The Penultimate Truth, published around this same frantic window in 1964, was met with a very mixed reception from the science fiction community. The little money that the book made was soon exhausted by his debt, and just as it was when he was in his early 20s, Philip was writing a novel at 10 times the pace of any other writer, just to pay his rent. While Philip worked away incessantly in the dark, outside, everything was changing. The 60s had truly arrived, and the clean-cut structure of the post-World War II suburbia was becoming not only a fading memory, but the very framework which a new generation was about to overthrow. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, the assassination of John F. Kennedy ruptured the American psyche. By September of 1964, the release of the Warren Report, with its highly dubious and simple explanation of the lone gun and single bullet, sprung a cultural cynicism and a paranoia that has not only remained but strengthened. The same public who had sat happily in front of their electric glass boxes to be told the truth by orderly and clean-cut men were now beginning to realize there might have been other actors on the stage. Perhaps their lines were being whispered to them by controllers they would never know. In 1964, Ken Kesey, loaded up on LSD 2 years after publishing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was now flying across America on a brightly painted school bus with a sign on the back that read, "Caution, weird load." It was the time of Beatlemania and the British invasion. Pete Townsend of The Who was smashing up his guitar while swallowing the same amphetamines as Philip K. Dick. The youth had found their rallying cry: rebel against the man, overthrow the establishment, down with the CIA and the system. It was a counter-reaction to everything that had been holding America together, and for a writer with the energy and cultural insight of Philip K. Dick, it was the perfect canvas on which to draw. In the midst of the free speech movement, and with a decade of being surrounded by radical left-wing activists, Philip knew, and felt too, the suspicions of the government, especially since the FBI visits to his home. His paranoia grew, and so too did America's. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 was seen by many as a ploy to drag them further into a new conflict in a country few had heard of, called Vietnam. It was the genesis of conspiracy theories, mistrust, and the radical purple haze. Hunter S. Thompson was discovering his love for chemical aids too, and was about to be assigned a report on Hell's Angels that would create the concept of gonzo journalism. Writing was changing and the old ways were not coming back. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, was mixing Kubrick's madness with a deepening sense of normalized dread around the Cold War. And all the while, Philip K. Dick was there, riding the tempest, working at a pace that was testing even him. In the midst of it, he met Nancy Hackett. She was only 21, 14 years younger than he was. Nancy was a soft-spoken, quiet woman who was herself recovering from a severe nervous breakdown. They met through mutual acquaintances in the Bay Area's increasingly strange countercultural circles. Philip immediately felt some deep kinship with her and empathy for the struggles which he too knew so well. They quickly fell in love and shared again that intellectual, creative and energizing rush that he'd first felt with Cleo in the same part of America a decade before. They moved into a new home together in San Rafael. Rather than causing escalating fights and difficulties, Nancy's quiet, accepting presence was a conduit for his writing. In this corner of relative quiet, surrounded by his beloved vinyl, philosophical tomes and towering manuscripts, he would soon begin the works that would change everything. But before that, in a work he'd already begun that was not yet published, there was the 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. His darkest, most terrifying novel, and one that even more so than Martian Time-slip could imbue the reader with their own sense of madness. The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch was published in 1965, but Philip had begun it more than a year earlier, while still in the greatest depth of loneliness. It was the novel that he produced while psychologically isolated, half insane, completely consumed by amphetamines, alcohol, paranoia, and the shifting walls of reality that had finally fallen in on him. There is no novel like it.
I'm sure a lot of people who've read your books think to themselves, it's all acid head. It's all come from drugs. But obviously you were putting together this relativistic, if you like, view of the world before you played around with chemicals. Or am I wrong?
You would have to posit that I brilliantly managed to synthesize LSD 25 in the 40s. In the mid-40s.
Well, we haven't mentioned any dates.
Backyard.
I wasn't exactly sure where I was, but it seemed to me that...
many years before Hoffman was synthesized, that I had stumbled onto it. My views were very, very fully formulated before I even... for instance, take my book, The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which, of course, is classic LSD novel, that all I had to go on was an article by Aldous Huxley about LSD, and I just thought, gee, what a great idea. Private worlds. I knew about that already. I mean, I was quite ready to admit that there were private worlds. I was reading Time Out of Joint, which I wrote in the 50s, which was, I know LSD now had been, Hoffman had found it, working at Sandoz, he had found it, but I had never heard of it, of course, then. And I was reading Time Out of Joint, and the guy walks up to the lemonade stand, at the park, and it turns into a slip of paper marked soft drink stand. And he puts the slip of paper in his pocket. I thought, far fucking out! Spacey! And I thought, that's an acid experience. Now, if I didn't know any better, I'd say this person had turned on many times and his world was dissolving. Mm-hmm. And you can date when these books were written,
The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch is set on a hostile and ruined Earth, a world so scorched by escalating temperatures that the population can only survive inside specialized cooling suits and protective buildings. To alleviate the strain, the UN has begun to draft and force citizens to colonize Mars, but the promise of the new frontier is a lie. Mars is a barren, depressing, and utterly hopeless environment. The initial enthusiastic attempts at farming have all failed, and the clean dream of the space pioneers has already turned into literal dust. To escape the grim truth of their existence, the miserable colonists in literal hovels have built a lifestyle shaped around a hallucinogen called Ken-D. The drug allows for a state of collective telepathic dreaming, but it requires a physical anchor, elaborate dollhouses and miniature characters that the colonists have to buy. When they take Ken-D, they slip entirely into the layout, psychologically projecting their consciousness into the bodies of the dolls. The doll which the women inhabit is Perky Pat, and the men her boyfriend Walt. Within the shared illusion, the colonists use the avatars of the dolls to sleep with each other, acting out raw, hedonistic desires while they completely ignore or suppress their own waking lives. While their physical bodies lie comatose and decaying on Mars, their minds interlock in a plastic, artificial paradise. All the while, the enigmatic captain of interplanetary industry, Palmer Eldritch, returns from an interstellar voyage. Eldritch brings back an alien substance known as True Z, harvested from a strange lichen in space. Unlike Candy, which requires physical layouts, group participation, and a shared template, True Z requires no props. It's marketed to the colonists with the slogan, "God promises eternal life, we deliver it." The worst part, however, arrives when the characters awake. When they believe that the True Z is worn off and they've returned to reality, they discover the truth. By consuming True Z, they have become permanently infused with Palmer Eldritch. They begin to display the trinity of his stigmata: mechanically, horizontally slitted steel eyes, a robotic, artificial right arm, and metallic teeth. Eldritch, the omnipotent conjurer of a false reality, with one all under his wings, has become God. It was the first time that Philip had become openly theological, while channeling the influence of his now widening drug use directly into his novels, laying bare his magnetic yet repulsed relationship with them. In the text, True Z experience is compared to the forbidden apple in Eden, and Barney describes it as a horrific descent into a personal fall. Philip was beginning to find God, yet this was no prophet from the Bible, but some terrifying, all-omnipotent force. If there was a God, so too might there be a devil, and Eldritch was the face he wore. The three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch was followed by Dr. Bloodmoney, or How We Got Along After the Bomb, later in 1965. The novel is set in a post-apocalyptic landscape after a rogue scientist named Dr. Bruno Bluthgeld accidentally starts a nuclear war. Amidst the ruins of California, the survivors' only salvation comes from Walt Dangerfield, an idealistic astronaut who was launched into orbit before the bombs fell. Dangerfield broadcasts to the ruins from his collection of classical vinyl records and reads aloud great works of literature, chapter by chapter. For the broken survivors below, Dangerfield becomes a disembodied, omnipotent surrogate father figure, the last living tied to the world before the fire. The narrative darkens as Dangerfield begins to fall ill, and his voice over the radio begins to crack and weaken, causing mass panic. The threat, it turns out, comes from Hoppy Harrington, a mutated grotesque born without arms or legs. Hoppy travels around the wasteland in a specialized motorized car and possesses a mutant telekinetic ability to manipulate machinery and projects his voice over radio frequencies. Driven by his greed for social status and power, Hoppy attempts to telekinetically murder Dangerfield in his satellite, intending to hijack the astronaut's radio frequency and become the new voice in the sky. This is prevented by one of the most crucial characters in all of Philip's bibliography, Bill Keller. If the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch was his first open fray with God, this was his first with Jane. She was here, back now, as she always had been, but this was the first time he had the courage in the world to set her down on the page. Bill is a fully conscious twin fetus who was never born. Instead, he lives entirely as a miniature, internal entity inside the body of his sister, Edie. When Hoppy Harrington attempts to seize control of the community's consciousness, the secret unborn twin utilizes his own psychic ability to pull Hoppy's consciousness out and into the realm of the dead. 35 years after Jane's death, she had come back to save the world, but in reality, Philip was suffering more than ever. Following his flight from Point Reyes, the legal proceedings with his third wife Anne had dragged out through 1964 until the final divorce was handed down in October of 65. Philip had now been away from his biological daughter with Anne, 4-year-old Laura, for 2 years, and the guilt was crushing him. He had to pay heavy alimony and child support and felt trapped by these financial expectations. He genuinely believed that Anne might try to kill him, and this became his justification for not seeing Laura. He told himself that he was too terrified to return to the house. Instead, he lived in a frenzy of radical hysteria in the midst of the 60s in Berkeley, writing novels about madness, drugs, and mutant telepaths in a half-ruin of an apartment, poisoning himself slowly with an increasing array of chemicals and a lifestyle which he knew was breaking his mind. His agoraphobia became so crushing that he dreaded even leaving his apartment. In 1966, he published Now Wait for Last Year and The Crack in Space, serving as direct, painful mirrors to the past, filled with characters caught in failed marriages and failing relationships. In Now Wait for Last Year, he drew a brilliant organ transplant doctor trapped in an abusive marriage to a woman who intentionally destroys herself with a time-bending drug, causing a vicious cycle where characters are cast helplessly back and forth through time to relive their worst regrets. In The Crack in Space, the outside world becomes a claustrophobic nightmare where millions of discarded, unwanted people are frozen in dark vaults by the bureaucratic elite with little hope of escape. Philip was reliving the wreckage of his marriage and Point Reyes over and over, and so he tried again. On July the 6th of 1966, Philip married Nancy. The ceremony was officiated by his close friend, the radical Episcopal Bishop James Pike. Nancy soon gave birth to a daughter on March the 15th of 1967, Isa Old Freya, whom they called Isa. Philip had chosen her name in homage to Wagner's opera. The relationship, however, was already breaking apart. Philip was in a state of semi-delirium, driven by his years of amphetamine use, incessant work, and paranoia. He was becoming increasingly certain that the FBI and Anne were plotting against him or trying to poison him. On top of this, any money he made from the novels was consumed by his debts. In 1968, he joined the Writers and Editors War Tax protest, signing his name to pledge to withhold his income tax to oppose the Vietnam War. In response, the IRS impounded his car, leaving him legally and physically stranded. On the surface, the late 1960s presented an environment that should have validated Philip's work. The broader counterculture had finally discovered the shifting realities, psychedelic alterations, and anti-authoritarianism that had always been in his work. The youth were beginning to treat his text seriously, and many were being understood and celebrated, yet Philip found himself deeply alienated by the very counterculture that claimed him. While the youth might have celebrated the use of LSD and other drugs as tools of liberation, Philip, knowing full well the realities of amphetamine use for over a decade, viewed drugs not as a path to enlightenment but an insidious form of chemical conditioning that could strip humanity of its empathy. It was at this time that he wrote and published his most enduring work, a book that essentially came to define an entire genre and birth one of the most beloved and widely appreciated aesthetics in all of fiction, cyberpunk, the visual manifestation of the 1980s and the luscious, vivid world of Blade Runner. At the heart of it all lay the novel from which it came, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. It came the same year as 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes. In 1968, science fiction became universal. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is set in a smog-filled, radiation-blazed San Francisco in the year 1992. Atmospherically, the novel had finally captured in all dimensions the internal prism in which Philip lived, but given the flesh of what is now called world-building. The novel combined the unapologetic depth of philosophy that Philip had tethered from the classics with its absolute unburdened realistic dialogue, laser-fast action sequences, cinematic encounters, and gleeful science fiction technology from the pulp days. Rick Deckard is a bounty hunter, tasked with hunting down and retiring 6 escaped Nexus 6 androids who have murdered their human overseers on Mars and are now trying to pass on Earth. The androids are superficially indistinguishable from people, possessing incredible intellect and strength, yet they have a tell, a philosophical crux through which the whole novel enigmatically rotates: empathy. It is that theme that fills the world, one where the boundaries between the real and the artificial are constantly elusive, curated, and maintained. Because of the radiation, real live animals are incredibly scarce and valuable, serving as the ultimate symbol of status and wealth. This is what motivates Rick, to retire enough of these androids so that he can buy his own animal. The novel became Blade Runner. In many ways, it became Philip K. Dick's legacy, at least in the mainstream. For years after, his books were and still are printed with, from the author of Blade Runner, in striking font. And though the film and all that came after was in many ways a perfect embodiment of Philip's aesthetic, inevitably much of the quality of its philosophy and the complexity of its characters was lost. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was immediately followed by what is considered, not only by Philip K. Dick and science fiction fans, but by the literary world at large, one of the finest novels of the 20th century, Ubik. Each chapter begins with a satirical advert introducing the consumer to the mysterious product Ubik, such as, taken as directed, Ubik provides uninterrupted sleep without morning after grogginess. You're awake and fresh, ready to tackle all those annoying problems facing you. Do not exceed recommended dosage. If the central theme of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was empathy, and Ubik it was entropy. There's some time before the reader finds out what Ubik actually is, but as soon as the novel begins, we're launched into a far more vivid, absurd, and comical world than any of the environments Philip had introduced before. The protagonist, Joe Chip, is remarkably normal, casual, and flawed. He's a radical change from the hardened bounty hunter Rick Deckard. Joe Chip is a technician working for Glenn Runnisitter. Like Philip K. Dick, he had his everyday gripes with money and was struggling to get by. This is compounded by the fact that in Ubik, virtually everything, including one's fridge or the lock on the apartment door, is coin-operated. The devices are also programmed to talk and have distinct personalities, which ensures constant bickering with the appliances to do as they're told, or negotiating with them over the price of their use. As was well established in Philip's work at this point, telepathy and psychic powers have reached the point of corporate banality and are simply a working part of any successful business. Incorporating telepaths or precogs, those who see the future, as routine business, but there exists too within this field a range of abilities and capabilities. This means that companies also have to have anti-telepaths, or what are called inertials, to block any corporate espionage by their rival psychics. Joe Chipp works for Glenn Rensselaer's anti-psychic security agency. He is trained to locate and assess the ability of these inertials when he finds an extraordinary young woman, Pat Conley. It appears that anti-telepathy ability is so strong that not only does she stop the precog ability to see into the future, she can actually reverse it. That is, she can, within her subjective immediacy, reverse time. Joe is initially unsure about such volatile power, but Rensselaer takes the chance and Joe hires her. Joe, Rensselaer, and his team, and some of the most outlandish clothes ever put on the page, including Al Hammond in his green felt knickers, grey golf socks, a badger hide open midriff blouse, and imitation patent leather pumps, are sent to the moon to investigate a station that might be hosting a large base of spying telepaths. When they arrive, however, there is a bomb blast and Rensselaer is killed, leaving Joe and the team in a desperate situation and trying to find a way to keep him alive until they get him back to Earth. The strangest thing is Pat, with her apparent time reversal ability, is unable to alter it. In the world of Ubik, there are life-saving cold pack pods which can keep an individual who is at the point of death alive, or at least they can sustain their brain activity for some time more. As long as the clients pay for the expensive procedure and upkeep, they can communicate with them, speaking to them for some time until their brain eventually dies. When the team get back to the hospital on Earth and put Rensselaer's body in suspension, however, unsettling things begin to happen. When Joe is lighting a cigarette, it suddenly turns to ash as if it's decayed and been subject to a rapid flow of time. When he puts a coin in the telephone to make a call, Rensselaer's head appears on one side of it. Fresh milk sours before he can put it in his coffee, and even the very forms of objects and pieces of technology begin to revert into earlier, more primitive forms. At the twilight of the 60s, in Ubik and To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, Philip had produced what may be his finest and most lasting novels, but he'd given up any last attempts at a conventional and healthy life. In August of 1969, it finally caught up with him. Philip experienced severe pain and was rushed to Marion General Hospital. He was diagnosed with acute pancreatitis and kidney failure, a life-threatening situation that left him incapacitated for months.
I had pancreatitis at one time. And this means that I can't really drink. I mean, no one who's had pancreatitis can ever really drink. And I'd never really drunk anyway. And I didn't get pancreatitis from drinking. I got it from bad street dope. And it had a film developer in it. Almost killed me. So one time I finally said to him, I said, look, I used to be a drug addict. And I got street dope and it had film developer in it, and it ate my pancreas, it damaged my liver, it fucked up, it caused total kidney shutdown. Total, absolute 100% kidney shutdown. I almost died. And I said, if I would tell you this, wouldn't I tell you if I drank? Good boy. These were fake Mexican Benny car wheels marketed by the Hells Angels, and they were poison.
As 1969 drew to a close, Philip's physical breakdown came at the exact same time that the counterculture wave he had ridden began to crash down too. The California hippie culture transformed into something very different from the peace and love it may have started with, and after the Manson family murders, it would never truly recover. In December, the Rolling Stones held the Altamont Speedway Free Festival in Northern California, a massive concert intended to be the successor to Woodstock. Instead, the event descended into hellish chaos and violence, ending in the televised stabbing of an audience member by the Hells Angels, whom the organizers had hired as security. In the final months at the turn of the decade the dream was over. The 1970s would be an era marked by Richard Nixon, the war on drugs, and the Vietnam tragedy. An epitaph was soon to be written by Hunter S. Thompson. There was madness in any direction at any hour. If not across the bay, then up the Golden Gate or down 101 to Los Santos or La Honda. You could strike sparks anywhere. There was a fantastic universal sense that whatever we were doing was right, that we were winning. And that, I think, was the handle. That sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. Not in any mean or military sense, we didn't need that. Our energy would simply prevail. There was no point in fighting, on our side or theirs. We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west. And with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high watermark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. The wave did break and roll back, and it took Philip K. Dick in the undertow. In 1970, Nancy left him with their daughter. She, like those before her, could not live in the fractured world of Philip K. Dick that was so perfect for fiction. He was left alone again, about to dissolve into the strangest era of his life and become a part of the very fiction he had once only written about. In 1970, Philip K. Dick was alone again, and for the first time in his adult life, he couldn't write. He had been forced to withdraw from the amphetamines he'd used to produce every novel since he was in his 20s, and after suffering acute pancreatitis and kidney failure, it would take months to recover. He was in a fluctuating state of paranoia, and the tide of counterculture circles he'd swum in had run too high. Despite the early elation of their relationship, it was an impossible situation for a new mother and a baby. Nancy had to leave. The 60s were over, and the refugees of a decade-long excursion were looking for somewhere to land. After Nancy and Isa left, Philip began to let them in. His home became a way station and a stopping point for drug addicts, petty thieves, freaks, wasters, and the misfits he'd once only written about. He still blared out German opera from classic vinyl and locked himself away in the half-light. He spent what little money he had from royalties on keeping his house an open-door landing pad for the wash-ups. As soon as he was physically able, he started taking illegal street speed. Unchecked by anyone who cared for him, he could indulge his paranoia. He spent hours checking his mail, inspecting his house for bugs, looking for patterns in newspaper articles and radio broadcasts, trying to formulate what plans the government and the FBI had for him. He had begun a manuscript, Flow My Tears, the policeman said, when Nancy was still with him, but unlike any other piece of writing he'd attempted before, he would be unable to complete it for another 2 years. It was in this interim of personal and artistic difficulty, however, that the concept of a scanner darkly was born, and there would be many more years of hardship before he could write it. Before then came one of the strangest events in Philip K. Dick's life, and an incident that has still not been solved. On November the 17th, 1971, Philip came home late, unlocked his front door, turned on the living room lights, and found his house completely devastated. His stereo was gone, the floor was covered in water, and pieces of drywall had been blown apart. Strangely, and most terrifyingly, the huge 1,100-pound fireproof steel and asbestos file cabinet where he kept his official paperwork, letters, and manuscripts had been blown apart. It was breached not crudely, as if from a common break-in, but with military-grade plastic explosives. There were marks on the floor from combat boots. It had been an organized, professional, and well-funded operation. The morning afterward, Philip went to report the crime and presented a list of everything that had been stolen to the police. But according to an interview he later gave to Paul Williams, published in Rolling Stone in 1975, the police initially refused to believe him. They told Philip that there'd been no robbery and there was no record of it. Philip became intensely agitated, demanding that someone come by to see the damage for themselves. It wasn't until 2 days later that the investigators arrived, and when they did, they suspected Philip of doing it himself. When Philip put the idea to the police that it wasn't a random burglary, but a targeted operation, the local sergeant said, "We don't want a crusader here in Marin County. You better move away, or you'll get a bullet in the back some night, or worse." Philip pressed him on what could possibly be worse than a bullet in the back, and the officer replied, "You wouldn't want to know." The surrealness of the situation seemed, ironically, not to actually worsen Philip's paranoia, but to validate it. He'd spent years convinced that the FBI or some other secretive, more nefarious wing of the state was watching him. Now, this was the closest he ever came to physical proof. The incident has still never been solved, but a number of theories emerged over the years. Philip later met a man who claimed to be a former Special Forces operative. He told Philip that he might have stumbled onto a classified truth the government wanted covered up, and he published it in one of his novels. The theory, although far-fetched, is not entirely implausible. During the Johnson and Nixon era, domestic espionage programs like Operation Chaos routinely infiltrated counterculture organizations, opened mail, and executed illegal burglaries. Operation Chaos ran from 1967 until late 1974, and they compiled information on over 7,000 American citizens and planted undercover spies within peaceful groups, just as Philip had been originally approached by the FBI to do so in the mid-1950s. When Project Chaos was exposed to the public by the New York Times, the image of the American intelligence organizations was marred to such an extent that it never truly recovered. From this point on, in all of Philip's work and personal philosophy, the government would forever be seen on the edge of totalitarianism and constantly finding ways to encroach on the rights of innocent citizens. In regards to the break-in of Philip's home, the idea of a writer accidentally revealing information to the public through his fiction, or being suspected of using it as a form of intelligence, was the exact plot of 3 Days of the Condor, which was released in September 1975, the exact same year as the Rolling Stones article. Philip had lived through a piece of far-fetched conspiracy fiction, and like so many of the protagonists in his own novels, he fled. After the warning from the police, he knew he had to leave. He had to take it seriously. He wasn't sure if the police were implying that they would deal with him, or if he was going to bring the trouble on himself. Either way, he knew he had to leave Marin County. In February of 1972, Philip was given the perfect way out, an all-expenses-paid trip by the science fiction societies of Simon Fraser University and the University of British Columbia. They invited him to Canada to be the guest of honor and keynote speaker at the second annual Vancouver Science Fiction Convention. The timing was perfect, and for Philip, it was a divine intervention. He had, at this time, also recently fallen into an obsessive infatuation with a 19-year-old girl from among the drifters that were circling him called Kathy. He was so enamored with her that he sent an advance press release to the Vancouver Province newspaper, telling them that his next novel he was working on was going to be named after her, and he hoped that everyone would welcome her too when they arrived together at the conference. At the last minute though, Kathy sold her plane tickets for cash and abandoned him. Heartbroken, humiliated, and the bank actively foreclosing on his home, Philip boarded the plane on the night of February 16, 1972, in a very fragile state. At 43 years old, he was leaving the United States for the first time. He traveled light, bringing only a single suitcase, his winter coat, and the manuscript pages of the radical, 42-page speech he intended to deliver, called The Android and the Human. He was leaving with a growing hostility towards America, particularly what he saw as the creeping authoritarianism and chicanery of the Nixon administration. When he arrived and gave his speech, he was sweating, trembling, and clearly on the edge. The breakup and betrayal just a few days before, the loss of his wives and children, of his home, of the creeping intervention of the state, and the feeling of a hollow, technologically determined future were all weighing down on him. In the speech, he said, "The reduction of human beings to mere use, men made into machines, serving a purpose which, although good in the abstract sense, has, for its accomplishment, employed what I regard as the greatest evil imaginable. The placing on what was a free man who laughed or cried and made mistakes and wandered off into foolishness and play, a restriction that limits him, despite what he may imagine or think, to the fulfilling of an aim outside of his own personal, however puny, destiny, as if, so to speak, history has made him into its instrument." To Philip, this mechanized enslavement wasn't a fantasy future of his fiction. It was a sincere and apparent threat that had already corrupted America. And later in the speech, describing his fragmented life in contemporary California, Philip said, "The totalitarian society, envisioned by George Orwell in 1984, should have arrived by now. The electronic gadgets are here. The government is here, ready to do what Orwell anticipated. So the power exists, the motive, and the electronic hardware. And although the use of Orwellian predictions and the relationship to technology is now commonplace, in 1972, the Declaration sent a visible shockwave through the hall. Philip was now beginning to sweat profusely and tremble. He suddenly broke script to renounce the United States, announcing that he was moving to Canada permanently. And it was more than just a flight from the American government that was motivating him. Philip had met a dark-haired woman named Janice, of the same age and type as Kathy, and immediately fell into another consuming infatuation. And they couldn't become a citizen by announcing it, but Philip, in his radical state of mind, had not even considered the true method by which he would actually stay. Instead, he took up an invitation by one of the attendees, a fan of his work, Michael Walsh, a movie critic for the local newspaper, The Province, along with his wife, Susan, to stay at their home. Unfortunately, Philip, who was now suffering quite severely from amphetamine withdrawal and clearly in a state of terrible psychological pressure, began making inappropriate, escalating advances towards Susan until the couple asked him to leave. After just 2 weeks, Philip was alone again on the Vancouver streets. He tried to salvage the situation by moving in with Janice, the young woman he'd met. He had already signed a short-term lease on a suite for them on Cornwall Avenue, securing the deposit with a scramble of cash from his speaker's fee and the frantic liquidation of what he had left in California. He and Janice moved into the apartment in a desperate frenzy, but Janice was soon scared away by Philip's increasingly manic state. She left Vancouver entirely and left Philip alone. On March the 23rd, 1972, inside the quiet, empty apartment overlooking the beach, he tried to kill himself. He'd managed to acquire a large quantity of potassium bromide, a potent sedative. He swallowed all of it. Sitting alone, he panicked. Midway through the overdose, in a haze, he reached for the telephone. Before he'd taken the overdose, he'd scrawled down the number for the British Columbia Crisis Center nearby, in case he changed his mind. He wanted to live. He called them. When he spoke to them, they told him to claim that he was a heroin addict and they'd be able to get him treatment at a new rehab center. Conscious enough to agree to this and to unlock the door so the medical workers could get in, Philip then collapsed on the floor. A van was sent over immediately. When the staff arrived, they pulled Philip up, a moment he would later describe as being scooped up like a puddle of ooze. When he arrived at the facility, it soon became clear that Ex-Calais was no ordinary rehab center. The experimental nature of their new model was one of destruction, tough love, and physical remaking. After the first night, they didn't try to comfort him or let him rest. They took his clothes, gave him a uniform and a mop, and told him to start cleaning. He spent his first few weeks undergoing physical withdrawal and doing manual chores, but the most harrowing part of his recovery was participating in Ex-Calais' confrontational style of group therapy known as The Game. Run without professional therapists, these sessions were verbal assaults encouraged by the staff where residents insulted, degraded, and demeaned each other until their personalities were completely destroyed, and then could be re-engineered as a whole new one with no trace of the drug-seeking behavior intact. Philip was conflicted in his feelings towards the center. He understood for the first time that they had helped him truly rid himself of his speed addiction. They had saved his life, but he was horrified by the state of the broken-down addicts and by what he saw as the inhuman fascist tactics of the center. It soon became clear to them that he was more skilled as a writer than a cleaner, and the center promoted him to the PR department to write for them, warning young people off drugs. Philip agreed and believed in it. He stayed as a resident in Escalade for a month, remaining under their guidance until May of 1972. And it had done more than just cure him of speed. It had given him the fictional setting for one of the most remarkable locations in all his work, the New Path Clinics in A Scanner Darkly. During this time, back in America, his literary agent Scott Meredith had been tracking what was happening to Philip. Meredith was a huge, influential agent in New York, representing figures like Norman Mailer and Arthur C. Clarke. And although Philip had severed all ties to his past life in Marin County, he needed to keep in contact with Meredith to track his royalties, publishing schedule, and receive mail. Meredith worked with Dr. Willis E. McNally, an English professor at California State University, to make a new plan for Philip. McNally was an academic pioneer who considered science fiction serious literature. He'd been in touch with Philip just before he entered rehab, and McNally saw him as a broken genius in need of help. McNally and a circle of local science fiction fans offered some of their own money, while Meredith advanced royalties to Philip so he could rent an apartment in Orange County and give him a clean, drug-free start in Southern California. When Philip arrived at Los Angeles International Airport in late April of 1972, he was wearing a sports coat, holding a Bible, and his luggage was a cardboard box suitcase tied shut with a spare extension cord. But he was back home and sober. Professor McNally helped him move into a quiet apartment complex on East Wilshire Avenue. For a Berkeley bohemian with over a decade in the counterculture, a thoroughly conservative Southern California suburb was a world Philip had forgotten existed, but the new environment was exactly what he needed to stay healthy and grounded. His first few months in Fullerton were, as described by the Penfield mood organ, a period of long-desired peace. He was also very tired. 20 years of speed and chaos had taken their toll, and Philip would never quite be the same. He had gone, and would go, months without writing. Neighbors from this period record him as a nice, friendly, but tired and worn figure. He wore wrinkled clothes, had thin grey hair, and was visibly recovering from an illness which had nearly taken his life. His days were no longer a frenzy of speed and madness. He spent his afternoons walking quiet suburban streets, casually shopping in the local grocery store, and listening to classical music. Philip was drawn to the academic community at the California State University, which had so eagerly helped him. Professor McNally treated Dick not as a recovering drug addict to be kept at a distance, but as a serious literary figure. He invited Philip to lecture classes and speak with students. For the first time in his life, Philip was not just being celebrated by hardcore science fiction fans or strange figures from the streets, but by real academics and intellectuals whom he'd always wanted to be among. By July of 1972, during this period of much-needed stability, he met his fifth and final wife. At a local beach party, he met an 18-year-old woman named Leslie Tessa Busby. Tessa quickly recognized Philip's vulnerability and was eager to be a part of his life and help him as she could. Philip would still slip into periods of depression, and Tessa would intentionally provoke philosophical debates with him to draw him out of it. Within weeks, Tessa moved into the Fullerton apartment with Philip. They had just enough money to get by and they were happy. Philip had new friends, and not ones that used him for his house and his access to drugs. He had a girlfriend who genuinely cared about him and would not betray him for money. The pain of Vancouver and those terrible months began to lessen. Fortunately, at this time too, Philip began to try and heal the past as he could in its entirety. He was in more regular contact with his ex-wives and children. His daughters, Laura and Isa, had been kept away from him during the worst periods of his addiction and erratic behavior. But after being convinced that rehab had helped him, the mothers agreed for them to see him once more. On April the 18th, 1973, Philip and Tessa were officially married, and just a few months later, on July the 25th, 1973, their son, Christopher Kenneth Dick, was born. Daily life was orderly and stable. Tessa managed the household, trying to shield Philip from the financial chaos of his mounting debts. Philip, just as he had with Anne at Point Reyes, became an attentive and caring father, helping out with household chores and with baby Christopher. It may have seemed closer to the idyllic American suburban life Philip K. Dick had always questioned, but in reality, the family lived on the brink of financial ruin. The royalties from his books were barely enough to cover day-to-day expenses, and Philip's past had left him with mounting bills. His agent, Scott Meredith, kept them afloat by issuing cash advances he could hold against future book sales. The financial stress worsened when the IRS targeted Philip for back taxes. Desperate to protect his few remaining assets, Philip made what he called a tax box, a heavy wooden crate filled with receipts, letters, and account listings that he constantly moved around the house, convinced the government might try to seize his home at any time. Just as it had at the beginning, the pressure of trying to make a living brought him back to the typewriter. At this point, Philip had not successfully completed a new novel in nearly 4 years. He had once written 11 novels in 2 years. To keep up his income at this time, some of his previous works were still being published, including A Maze of Death, Our Friends from Frolics 8, and We Can Build You. We Can Build You had actually been written a decade before in 1962 and rejected for years, while the others were the last novels from the intense writing period of the 1960s. There was one manuscript left from that time, and one that Philip knew was now ready, one that would not be rushed out for publication. He contacted Meredith and told him to retrieve a manuscript he'd abandoned during his 1971 breakdown. In 1970, Philip had typed out a complete but chaotic rough draft of a novel. Fearing its destruction during his paranoia, he had mailed the pages to Meredith, who'd kept them safe in New York. Now, sitting in his quiet Santa Ana home, Philip began a complete rewrite, incorporating everything that had changed within him. For the first time in his life, he was working without the manic engine of amphetamines. He took the drug-fueled 1970 draft and went over it meticulously, creating his finest novel since the masterworks of the late 60s. It was published in February of 1974. It was Flow My Tears, the Policeman said. It combined the multiverse of realities of anything as strange as the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch with the most realistic and chilling vision of the police state. It was a book born of the acid-head throes of the late 60s and the cold, sharp realization of what America had become as a result. In the novel, Jason Taverner, a rich and famous star, is attacked by a jealous lover. The actual incident is obscure, but it seems like she's thrown some kind of creature at him. When he wakes up in a sleazy, low-rent hotel room, he discovers that his entire identity has been erased. In a horrifying, dystopian America, governed by a ruthless police state, there is no record of Taverner's existence. Also, his fans have no memory of him, and his closest friends don't even recognize him. To a government that tracks every citizen with totalitarian precision, and where the rich and famous live in luxury while the poor are almost slaves, a man without an ID will be forced into a labor camp within days. The counter-character to Jason is Felix Buckman, a powerful police general hunting him. Buckman, strangely, although in theory the villain of the novel, is in many ways the principal character. The defining scene, and the one that lingers as much or more than anything in Philip K. Dick's entire work, comes when Buckman has a breakdown in the middle of the night. It felt very much like the clearest Philip ever came to setting down the pain and weight of those last 4 years, of the suicide attempt, and the great darkness that almost took him when he had no one and nothing left. Buckman breaks down midway through flying in his car and stops at a gas station where he strikes up a casual, an intimate conversation with a poor, an ordinary black man, asking him about his life and family. Buckman begins crying and lingers on the line, "Flow my tears," sharing a personal moment with this stranger in the distress of the night in the gas station glare. Years later, Philip would become convinced that this scene was a slip in time, a replaying of the biblical book of Acts where a disciple named Philip encounters an Ethiopian stranger on a desolate road. The ruthless high Roman official in the book is named Felix, and the most uncanny resemblance came in 1978 when a broken and crying Philip K. Dick pulled over in an all-night gas station, only to find himself embraced and comforted by a black stranger. It is surreal and tragic, yet like all of Philip K. Dick's life, it's understood in context. Felix Buckman breaks down in the novel because his twin sister Alice has just died, and the realization of his twin sister's death is what causes the quake. It was all here. Jane was back, and not just in the form of an unborn addition to another character, but in fully adult form. And by bringing her death back onto the page in all its entirety, Philip could finally reconcile with what would always be the greatest tragedy and most pivotal moment of his life. It had always been there, and in one of the most raw and moving moments of all his fiction, it came back. Flow My Tears, the policeman said, was a critical triumph, winning the prestigious John W. Campbell Memorial Award and securing a nomination for both the Hugo and Nebula Awards. He had spent 4 years in the wilderness, but now Philip K. Dick was back and completely revitalized his career, pulling him out of the science fiction fringes and establishing him as a literary figure once again. At this time too, he began to scanner darkly, returning gladly, at a distance now, to the hardest peaks of that period of chaos in the late 60s and the storm that came after. He had lost plenty of friends in the San Rafael days. Some were gone and some were insane, but he'd come back and now he was going to write about it. By 1974, Philip had successfully rebuilt his life in a way he hadn't done since the early days with Anne a decade before. He was a husband, a warm father to his 3 children, and a celebrated, award-winning writer again. Yet, as the old cliche runs, you may be done with the past, but the past is not done with you. Philip was and never could be just an ordinary man. If anything, the last 30 years had shown him that. It began with dentistry. In February of 1974, Philip underwent a minor dental procedure to extract an impacted wisdom tooth. He returned home groggy, heavily medicated with sodium pentothal, and in severe pain. Tessa called a local pharmacy for him to request a delivery of extra pain medication. When the doorbell rang, Philip answered it. On the porch was a young pharmacy delivery girl. Around her neck, she wore a golden pendant shaped like a fish. The Vasia Pisces, an ancient symbol used by early Christians, hiding their religion from the Romans. As Philip stared at the necklace, a beam of sunlight bounded from the glistening metal. In that moment, Philip experienced what he called divine intervention. He experienced the moment of revelation as a blinding flash of strawberry pink light that filled not his eyes but his entire mind. In his journals, and later in VALIS and Radio Free Albemarle, Philip would admit that he believed the pink light transmitted a stream of shifting geometric patterns, ancient languages, and interstellar godly information. He also knew this was completely insane and would spend the rest of his life reckoning with it. He knew how it sounded, yet to him it was true. The entity which he believed to communicated with him would be named, as in his novel VALIS, standing for Vast Active Living Intelligence System, and it had shown him the secret keys to the universe. Over the next 2 months, a period Philip will refer to as 2374 for February and March of 1974, the hallucinations intensified. He began hearing creepy, sinister voices on the radio. He witnessed phantom Roman architecture superimposed on California, and began to speculate that linear time was an illusion.
In 74, there came upon me, at the trough of my life, at the point where I saw nothing but inexplicable suffering, there came to me the Beatific vision, which calmed all my sense of horror at the world and my sense of the transcendent power of evil. And on the basis of this vision, we're speaking now of a time slightly over 5 years ago, just a bit over 5 years ago, I set out to write a book in which this was expressed in a way that made rational sense rather than simply mystical sense. That my mystical experience with the Beatific vision had to be formulated into some rational structure that could be transferred to other people. What did this amount to philosophically? My mental anguish was simply removed from me, as if by a divine fiat, that God...
This just happened to you on your own?
Yes.
There's no one else?
Yes, it just happened to me on my own. It was as if the primordial curse or fall had lifted from me, and that I was restored, healed. It was a sort of, intervention of a kind of a psychological, mystical type, which I described in VALIS.
Philip believed that the infinite point of time, upon which all timelines vacillated, was the infinite fight between good and evil, empire and oppressed. And this could be most clearly manifest in the time of the early Christians, as they held cover under the yoke of the Romans in 70 CE. The empire never ended, was his line for it, repeated over and over in his journal. The empire never ended. To the rational psychologist, the breakdown did not necessarily need to be anything supernatural. They could convincingly claim that this was a natural relapse for someone who had tested their body so thoroughly through years of drugs and physical exertion, especially under the stress of a potent drug that alters the chemical balance of the brain, such as the panthenol that Philip took. It's also true that L. Ron Hubbard first had his epiphany that would become Scientology under the drugs from a dental treatment, which he described as delivering him with a blinding, revelatory light. Coincidentally, both had written for the same science fiction magazines in the 50s. Philip's manifestations clearly mirrored so much of his own work. In The Man in the High Castle, the giveaway that one of his characters, Tagomi, sees that makes him realize he's been transported to another universe is a highway in San Francisco that was never built, much like the Roman architecture that Philip saw. Also, a voice from the radio is what alerts Regal Gum to the true nature of his reality, back in the late 1950s when Philip wrote Time Out of Joint. The manifestations of his fiction had become tangled in his mind, and if the incident had ended there, it might have easily been explained away. That, however, was not the end of it. The most significant moment was yet to come. Later, while sitting in the house listening to the Beatles song Strawberry Fields Forever, Philip claimed that the pink light returned with an urgent, hyper-specific warning. The voice inside his head informed him that his infant son, Christopher, was suffering from an acute, hidden medical defect that would kill him in days if left untreated. Christopher seemed completely fine and was showing no physical symptoms, but driven by the certainty of his vision, a panicked Philip forced a reluctant and skeptical Tessa to rush Christopher to the doctor. The doctor assured them that Christopher had already been checked as a baby and that there was nothing wrong. Philip, however, was steadfast and demanded that they check him for what he then relayed in specific medical terms he'd never read about nor studied. He said that Christopher had an acute right inguinal hernia. Unconvinced, but eventually relenting, the doctor agreed to carry out the inspection, and they discovered that Philip's diagnosis was perfect. The condition had caused a portion of Christopher's intestine to drop into the scrotal sac. If the tissue had become strangulated, it would have killed him. Christopher was scheduled for emergency surgery the next morning. The diagnosis saved his life. This Damascene miracle would, understandably, change Philip forever. In his fiction, he'd often written about such interventions, about extraterrestrial communication, about the arbitrary hands of fate and chance, and now what he'd experienced validated it for him. Something which, though at times he knew full well was insane, would forever in part or wholly believe. It did, however, bring back some ghosts of the past. He did not go as far as to procure amphetamines again. The physical damage of his abuse and the memories of that decline stayed his reach. Instead, he drank copious amounts of coffee and became, as he had done so long ago, awake and writing on caffeine all night. Apart from A Scanner Darkly, which would soon be finished, there would never be another work of writing anything like his former novels, science fiction or realistic. What he began working on now was an analysis of himself, his life, the experience, biblical text, the great works of the past and antiquity. He became more of a philosopher than an author. He began writing furiously in a diary, in what he called an exegesis, an interpretation of biblical text. His erratic tendencies and paranoia began to emerge once more. The unsettling film, The Manchurian Candidate, in which a secret, brainwashed asset from the Soviet Union is activated by a preordained cue in a pack of cards, became an obsession. In the film, this process is begun by playing solitaire. Tessa later recalled that this led Philip to ban all playing of cards in the house. He believed now that it was not just the FBI, but also the Soviet Union that was spying on him, as he manifested later in the novel Radio Free Albemuth. The intervention of VALIS, he believed, had made him a target. And because of this, there was an evil counterforce seeking him out because he had been blessed and chosen. Philip was acutely aware, at all times, of the seeming madness of these claims. No one, no psychologist or psychiatrist could better diagnose him. He knew exactly how preposterous and insane sounding all of it was. He ruminated on it constantly, till he came to the only conclusion that fit. It was not just he that was insane, but reality. Reality was not rational, and any rational attempt to understand it was insane. The endless late-night typewriting and the pressure of managing his escalating delusions once more brought about the end of another marriage. Tessa had tried to manage Philip for years, and had done so in a way that perhaps no one else had, but by 1976, it could continue no longer. She left him, and took Christopher with her. Later that night, Philip took a massive overdose of medication, and to ensure this time it would not be halted, he slashed his wrist with a razor and walked out to his garage, locking himself in his parked car and let the engine run. But it was not to be. He vomited up the pills, the blood in his wrist clotted, and the car's engine stalled out in the enclosed garage. Philip, in a choking, delirious haze, managed to make his way back into the house, where he collapsed on the floor, in and out of consciousness. He was awoken the next morning by a phone call from a pharmacist who was following up on a medication order. Philip managed to answer the phone and called out weakly for help. The pharmacist contacted the Fullerton Emergency Services, who dispatched an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, they found Philip barely conscious and bleeding. They managed to stabilize his condition and get him to the nearest hospital. After the doctors treated him, they contacted a local psychiatrist. Because of the suicide attempt, Philip was formally admitted to a psychiatric ward. The ward, as portrayed in VALIS, was mostly one of routine boredom and card games. Philip was able to look back on it with humor. He particularly enjoyed the fact that it was in a psychiatric hospital he was finally declared sane. This was while he was musing over an alien satellite, phantom Roman architecture, three-eyed aliens that might be communicate with him, and a growing belief that he was in a computer-simulated reality. But all of it fit with his theory. Reality was irrational. The Logos was insane. Act accordingly. And after 2 weeks, he was back home, and this time he was determined to finish that manuscript that had been circling for years, A Scanner Darkly, his last great conventional novel. It was an ultra-realistic examination of the truth and sordid horror and excitement of the San Rafael drug days, of the drifters and the sanguine sunset of the 60s. It also held the greatest layers of paranoia, shifting realities and selves, and now the dualist protagonist, the broken twin that Philip would become. Bob Octor, the protagonist, is a drug addict and police narcotic agent, and the drugs he consumes makes it harder and harder to tell where one ends and the other begins. The layers of subterfuge and spying within the junkies and the paranoia they all hold is as solid on the page as anything like the madness spilled in Martian Time-slip. But this time it didn't need any Martian setting to make it sing, because it was the madness of the streets, and Philip knew it as well or better than anyone, as so did the readers, and the novel was the clearest and most riveting record of the reality of the last days of manic drug consumption in 1960s America. It met with the growing paranoia and state surveillance of the Nixon administration, wrapped up in the genuine madness that Philip now felt. It was another masterpiece, and 50 years has only bettered it. It was during these final, isolated years in Santa Ana that Philip's daughters, Laura and Isa, now aged 16 and 9, began traveling to Orange County to visit him. Philip desperately wanted to be a stable, present parent, but his fluctuating agoraphobia and psychological limitations made it difficult. During one of these visits, Isa recalled that Philip had promised to take her to Disneyland, knowing that it was so close, just a few miles away. He'd promised her enthusiastically, "We're going to go and stay till it closes." She'd been incredibly excited for the trip and knew it was open until after midnight. But when they got there, the crushing crowds, the vibrant lights, and the chaotic atmosphere overwhelmed Philip. He told her, "Honey, my back's really hurting," and told her that they would have to leave. Isa quickly learned to better read and understand her father. When he was too depressed to see her, she knew that his excuse was always the flu. Yet despite his illness and his unpredictability, both Laura and Isa held deeply warm and fond memories of their father during his final years. They didn't remember him as an erratic and paranoid struggling writer, but as a deeply loving, gentle man who tried to make a calm and warm home for them. In Santa Ana, surrounded by his classical records and towering books, they got to see the best of him: gifts, laughter, weirdness, and a genuine emotional warmth. Laura forgave him for the first years of her life, and as she began to understand the severity of his condition and the mind he had to battle with, what mattered was that, alas, they had the chance to spend time together and repair those fractures of the past. One of the most remarkable, unfortunate moments came soon after in 1977, and it is the only long-form, high-quality video recording that remains of Philip K. Dick. Philip had been invited to France as the guest of honor at the Second International Science Fiction Festival in Metz. While mainstream America still largely dismissed science fiction, European audiences, especially the French, had long treated him as a major literary figure, and they revered his Scanner darkly. France would soon become the crucible of postmodern theory, but Philip got there first. It was 2 years before Jean-François Lyotard would introduce the postmodern condition in '79, and 4 years before Baudrillard would publish Simulacra and Simulation in '81. At Metz, the audience of science fiction fans had expected an entertaining speech about the wonder of technology, space travel, aliens, and the blending of philosophy and prose, but instead Philip decided to do something very different. He gave an hour-and-a-half monologue called, "If you find this world bad, you should see some of the others." The recording captured a bewildered crowd of French intellectuals who seemed unable to know what to make of it.
If you find this world bad, you should see some of the others. I would like to confess that I've been asked to cut about 2/3 of my speech out and deliver as short a speech as possible. Upon examining my speech, I find that it is very easy to remove 2/3 without doing any injury to it. I even considered cutting 3/3 out of it, but there was some trouble, so I abandoned that idea. The subject of this speech is a topic which has been discovered recently and which may not exist at all. I may be talking about something that does not exist. Therefore, I'm free to say everything or nothing. I can hardly make an error if there is no such thing as orthogonal time. Orthogonal or right-angled time is the topic of my speech. I put before you now the notion, which I personally find exciting, that he may have had in mind that which I speak of as the lateral axis of overlapping realms, which contain among them a spectrum of aspects ranging from the unspeakably malignant to the beautiful. And Christ was saying over and over again that there really are many objective realms, somehow related, and somehow bridgeable by living, not dead men, and that the most wondrous of these worlds was a just kingdom, in which either he himself or God himself or both of them ruled. And he did not merely speak of a variety of ways of subjectively viewing one world. The kingdom was and is an actual different place at the opposite end of continua, starting with slavery and utter pain. It was his mission to teach his disciples the secret of crossing along this orthogonal path. He did not merely report what lay there. He taught the method of getting there. But, tragically, the secret was lost. The enemy, the Roman authority, crushed it, and so we do not have it. But perhaps we can re-find it, since we know that such a secret exists. That we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off, became actualized instead of the prior one, and that in fact, in literal fact, we are once more living this particular segment of linear time. A breaching, a tinkering, a change had been made, but not in our present, had been made in our past. Evidently, such an alteration would have a peculiar effect on those persons involved. They would, so to speak, be moved back one square or several squares on the board game which constitutes our reality.
Decades before The Matrix would be filmed, or Silicon Valley would popularize simulation theory, Philip was blending technology and God, trying desperately to get across his theories which had been consuming him. To explain his 1974 visions, he tried to explain the concept of orthogonal time, a lateral, right-angle axis running perpendicular to normal linear time. He told the audience that parallel realities constantly branch off whenever the programmer, that is God, tweaks a past event. When this happens, our memories are instantly overwritten to match the new timeline, the phenomena of déjà vu. This was the exact plot point later used in The Matrix, though the writers never formally acknowledged if Philip K. Dick was the inspiration. The speech was quite disconcerting to the audience and the organizers. It wasn't clear if it was a performance, a profound moment of world-shaking genius, or a public display of madness. Philip returned to America, having given his speech on all that he felt that mattered. He later said that it had been quite jumbled and not as eloquent as he'd meant, but he believed in the core tenets, and he tried to say it in public at that conference. In August of 1978, Philip's mother, Dorothy, died of cancer. As per her instructions, she was cremated with no formal services, no religious rites, and no public or family gatherings. Over the last 10 years of her life, Philip had barely seen her. He'd intentionally kept away, keeping contact limited to formal letters and a strained, rare phone call. Philip had always had a very turbulent and uneasy relationship with his mother. He had never forgiven her for Jane. His father, Edgar, meanwhile, had essentially vanished from Philip's life since childhood, leading to 30 years of near-total abandonment. They had attempted a brief, deeply uncomfortable reunion between 1973 and 74, but it had failed. Philip found that they had absolutely nothing in common. His father detested his lifestyle, his work, and his entire worldview. When Philip finally attempted to confront him about the childhood abandonment, Edgar completely shut down. By the time Dorothy died, Philip had not seen his father in 4 years. They would never speak again. It was at this time that Philip began drafting his final great work, the culmination of everything that brought him to the end. He took his 1976 manuscript, VALIS System A, which had been rejected by publishers, and spent the next 2 years rewriting it. The initial draft, which contained many of the ideas in VALIS, such as writing himself in as two characters, one named Philip K. Dick and the other under a pseudonym, was published posthumously in 1985 as Radio Free Albemarle. He transformed the concept into something far more intimate and openly recounted his experience with suicide and the Psychiatric Institute. He created a dualistic work of autofiction where he split his own fractured psyche into both Philip K. Dick, the sci-fi writer, and Horse Lover Fat, a pseudonym created by translating his own name, as Philip in Greek means lover of horses and Dick in German means fat. Fat serves as the desperate, unstable visionary who receives the telepathic pink light. The resulting novel, published in 1981, was VALIS. It was more than just a novel or a confession of his struggles. It contained genuine extracts from his diaries and was an attempt to tell everybody and explain what he'd been going through. And it was followed by the Divine Invasion in 1981 and the Transmigration of Timothy Archer in 82. He spent the remaining years of his life consumed by the events of 1974, still unsure, even to the end, if he had been touched by a god, a satellite, three-eyed aliens, or just severe mental illness. In the first few months of the 1980s, another incredible intervention occurred, this one far more worldly. Philip K. Dick was still an obscure writer, largely unread by the American public, yet that saving grace that means the difference between survival and wealth for any writer, Hollywood, had discovered him. Ever since his publication in 1968, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep had been optioned and was floating around in Hollywood. Even a young Martin Scorsese had expressed some interest, but for a decade, like most adaptations, it seemed to have been forgotten. In the mid-1970s, a producer named Herb Jaff bought the rights. His son Robert Jaff wrote a screenplay that Philip despised. It changed the philosophical, deep, and beautiful novel into a goofy, low-budget comedy. When Robert Jeff flew out to discuss the script, Philip was so angry that when he met him at the airport, he asked him if he should beat him up right there by the baggage claim or wait until they got back to the apartment. After this, Philip was convinced that Hollywood would only water down and ruin his work. However, in 1977, right around the time that Skenedaki was published, an actor and screenwriter named Hampton Fancher saw Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep for what it was, keeping the philosophy present but in the background. Fancher's script coincided with a massive post-Star Wars rush. Science fiction in cinema was now not only mainstream but popcorn, it was selling. Hollywood studios were desperate for any viable and worthwhile science fiction properties they could find. The script caught the attention of producer Michael Dealey, who introduced it to Ridley Scott. Though Scott initially passed on the project to focus on Dune, a personal tragedy, the loss of his brother, made him reevaluate, and he eventually signed on, wanting a high-energy project to distract him from his grief. Scott saw the potential too, and the project was rapidly and massively financed into a high-end, wide-release blockbuster, renamed Blade Runner. Initially, Philip was very nervous about the project. He could see early versions of the script had stripped the narrative's philosophical weight, reducing his exploration of human empathy into an action movie. Terrified of his work being exploited into a laughingstock, Philip began to become very stressed. When, during a phone call, Ridley Scott admitted to him that he hadn't even read the whole book, Philip didn't think it was funny, he was furious. So, to make amends and to try to set him at ease, the production team invited Philip to a private studio screening in 1981. There, they played Philip a raw, 20-minute special effects showreel of the film's opening sequence. When the lights came back on, the room was dead silent. The producers waited for Philip's critique. Instead, he sat there, silent, transfixed. Philip thought it was the most remarkable manifestation of everything he'd imagined. He told them that they'd captured his inner world. On October 11th, 1981, he wrote an ecstatic letter to the studio, declaring that Blade Runner would completely revolutionize science fiction. He was right, and for a few moments at the end, it seemed like the life he'd worked for the one he'd given everything to bring his writing into the mainstream was about to occur. And then on February the 17th, 1982, just weeks after giving his final, optimistic interview about the film, Philip began experiencing severe tunnel vision and failing eyesight. Distressed, he called his therapist. Recognizing the signs of a neurological event, the therapist told him to go to the hospital, but Philip refused. He thought he was probably just tired and needed to lie down. The following day, some friends went to check on him after he failed to answer the phone. They unlocked the door and found him unconscious on the floor. He'd suffered a stroke. He was rushed to an Orange County hospital where he was placed on life support. As Philip K. Dick lay dying, his family gathered around his bedside. His daughters, Laura and Isa, sat with him alongside his young son Christopher, holding his hand as his vitals faded. On March 2, 1982, Philip K. Dick was pronounced dead at the age of 53. It would be his father who would claim his body. Joseph Edgar flew his remains back to Fort Morgan, Colorado, for it was there that Jane lay resting, and just as they had been so painfully parted at the beginning, at long last, they could be reunited at the end.
She presented me with the Beatific vision. She showed me a garden of such beauty that I could not believe it existed. And I walked around in it. I was actually in it. She transformed the landscape for me. Palm trees, beauty of its indescribable beauty, just indescribable beauty. And she said, when you get old and are dying, I will come back for you and take you there. But she said, I will not come back until then. She says, I have to leave now.